Chapter 6. The Secret Room. It was Sunday, May 10th, 1942, exactly 2 years after the fall of Holland. The sunny spring skies, the flowers in the lamp-post boxes did not at all reflect the city's mood. German soldiers wandered aimlessly through the streets, some looking as though they had not yet recovered from a hard Saturday night, some already on the lookout for girls, a few hunting for a place to worship. Each month the occupation seemed to grow harsher, restrictions more numerous. The latest heartache for Dutchmen was an edict making it a crime to sing the Wilhelmus, our national anthem. Father, Betsy, and I were on our way to the Dutch Reformed Church in Velsen, a small town not far from Haarlem, where Peter had won the post of organist in competition against 40 older and more experienced musicians. The organ at Velsen was one of the finest in the country. Though the train seemed slower each time, we went frequently. Peter was already playing, invisible in the tall organ loft, when we squeezed into the crowded pew. That was one thing the occupation had done for Holland. Churches were packed. After hymns and prayers came the sermon. A good one today, I thought. I wish Peter would pay closer attention. He regarded sermons as interesting only to venerable relics like his mother and me. I had reached 50 that spring. To Peter, the age at which life has definitely passed by. I would beg him to remember that death and ultimate issues could come for any of us at any age, especially these days. But he would reply charmingly that he was too fine a musician to die young. The closing prayers were said, and then, electrically, the whole church sat at attention. Without preamble, every stop pulled out to full volume. Peter was playing the Wilhelmus. Father, at 82, was the first one to his feet. Now everyone was standing. From somewhere in back of us, a voice sang out the words. Another joined in, and another. Then we were all singing together, the full voice of Holland singing her forbidden anthem. We sang at the top of our lungs, sang our oneness, our hope, our love for Queen and country. On this anniversary of defeat, it seemed almost for a moment that we were victors. Afterward, we waited for Peter at the small side door of the church. It was a long time before he was free to come away with us. So many people wanting to embrace him, to shake his hand and thump his back. Clearly, he was enormously pleased with himself. But now that the moment had passed, I was, as usual, angry with him. The Gestapo was certain to hear about it, perhaps already had. Their eyes and ears were everywhere. I thought of Nollie, home fixing Sunday dinner for us all. I thought of Peter's brothers and sisters, and Flip. What if he lost the principalship of the school for this? And for what had Peter risked so much? Not for people's lives, but for a gesture, for a moment's meaningless defiance. At Bolsenhovenstraat, however, Peter was a hero, as one by one his family made us describe again what had happened. The only members of the household who left, or felt as I did, were the 2 Jewish women staying at Nollie's. One of these was an elderly Austrian lady whom Wilhelm had sent into hiding here, Kato. As the family had rechristened her, was posing as the Van Warden's housemaid, although Nollie confided to me that she had yet so much as to make her own bed. Probably she did not know how, as she came from a wealthy and aristocratic family. The other woman was a young, blonde, blue-eyed Dutch Jew with flawless false identity papers supplied by the Dutch National Underground itself. The papers were so good, and Ananias looked so unlike the Nazi stereotype of a Jew, that she went freely in and out of the house, shopping and helping out at the school, giving herself out to be a friend of the family whose husband had died in the bombing of Rotterdam. Katrien and Ananias could not understand any more than I could Peter's deliberately doing something which would attract attention of the authorities. I spent an anxious afternoon, tensing at the sound of every motor, for only the police Germans and NSBers had automobiles now. By the time came to go home to the Beiji, and still nothing had happened. I worried 2 more days and then decided either Peter had been reported or that the Gestapo had more important things to occupy them. It was Wednesday morning, just as Father and I were unlocking our workbenches, that Peter's little sister Kaki burst into the shop. "Opa! Tanti Corey! They came for Peter. They took him away." "Who? Where?" But she didn't know, and it was 3 days before the family learned that he had been taken to the federal prison in Amsterdam. It was 7:55 in the evening, just a few minutes before the new curfew hour of 8 o'clock. Peter had been in prison for 2 weeks. Father and Betsy and I were seated around the dining room table, Father replacing watches in their pockets, and Betsy doing needlework. Our big, black, slightly Persian cat curled contentedly in her lap. A knock on the alley door made me glance at the window mirror. There, in the bright spring twilight, stood a woman. She carried a small suitcase, odd for this time of year, wore a fur coat, gloves, and a heavy veil. I ran down and opened the door. "Can I come in?" she asked. Her voice was high-pitched in fear. "Of course." I stepped back. The woman looked over her shoulder before moving into the little hallway. "My name is Claremaker. I'm a Jew." "How do you do?" I reached out to take her bag, but she held on to it. "Won't you come upstairs?" Father and Betsy stood up as we entered the dining room. "Miss Claremaker, my father and my sister." "I was just about to make some tea," said Betsy. "You're just in time to join us." Father drew out a chair from the table, and Miss Claremaker sat down, still gripping the suitcase. The tea consisted of old leaves which had been crushed and reused so often they did little more than color the water, but Miss Claremaker accepted it gratefully, plunging into her story of how her husband had been arrested some months before, her son gone into hiding. Yesterday, the SD, the political police who worked under the Gestapo, had ordered her to close the family clothing store. She was afraid now to go back to the apartment above it. She had heard that we had befriended a man on this street. "In this household," Father said, "God's people are always welcome." "We have 4 empty beds upstairs," said Betsy. "Your problem will be choosing which one to sleep in." Then, to my astonishment, she added, "First, though, give me a hand with the tea things." I could hardly believe my ears. Betsy never let anyone help in her kitchen. "I'm just a fussy old maid," she'd say. But Miss Claremaker had jumped to her feet with pathetic eagerness and was already stacking plates and cups. Just 2 nights later, the same scene was repeated. The time was again just before 8 on another bright May evening. Again, there was a fervid knock at the side door. This time, an elderly couple was standing outside. "Come in." It was the same story. The same tight-clutched possessions, the same fearful glance and tentative tread, the story of neighbors arrested, the fear that tomorrow their turn would come. That night, after prayer time, the 6 of us faced our dilemma. "This location is too dangerous," I told our 3 guests. "We're half a block from the main police headquarters, and yet I don't know where else to suggest." Clearly it was time to visit Willem again, so the next day I repeated the difficult trip to Hilversum. "Willem," I said, "we have 3 Jews staying right at the Beiji. Can you get places for them in the country?" Willem pressed his fingers to his eyes, and I noticed suddenly how much white was his beard. "It's getting harder," he said. "Harder every month. They're feeling the food shortage now, even on the farms. I still have addresses, yes, a few, but they won't take anyone without a ration card." "Without a ration card? But Jews aren't even issued ration cards." "I know." Willem turned to stare out the window. For the first time, I understood how he and Tyne were feeding. I wondered, actually, how he and Tyne were feeding the elderly men and women in their care. "I know," he repeated. "The ration cards can't be counterfeited. They're changed too often, and they're too easy to spot. Identity cards are different. I know several printers who do them, but of course you need a photographer." "A photographer? Printers?" What was Willem talking about? Willem, if people need ration cards and there aren't any counterfeit ones, what do? Willem turned slowly from the window. He seemed to have forgotten me and my particular problem. Ration cards, he gestured vaguely. You steal them. I stared at this Dutch Reformed clergyman. Then, Willem, could you steal? I mean, could you get 3 stolen cards? No, Corey. I'm watched. Don't you understand that? Every move I make is watched. He put an arm around my shoulder and went on more kindly. Even if I can continue working for a while, it'll be far better for you to develop your own sources. The less connection with me, the less connection with anyone else, the better. Joggling home on the crowded train, I turned Willem's words over and over in my mind. Your own sources. That sounded so professional. How was I going to find a source of stolen ration cards? Who in the world did I know? And at that moment, a name appeared in my mind. Fred Cornstra. Fred was the man who used to read the electric meter at the Beiji. The Cornstras had a retarded daughter and now a grown woman who attended the church. I had been conducting the feeble-minded for some 20 years, and now Fred had a new job working for the food office. Wasn't it in the department where ration cards were issued? That evening after supper, I bumped over the brick streets to the Cornstra house. The tires on my fateful old bicycle had finally given out, and I had joined the hundreds clattering about the towns on metal wheel rims, each bump reminding me jarringly of my 50 years. Fred, a bald man with a military bearing, came to the door and stared at me blankly when I said I wanted to talk to him about the Sunday service. He invited me in, closed the door, and said, Now, Corey, what is it you really came to see me about? Lord, I prayed silently, if it is not safe to confide in Fred, stop this conversation now before it's too late. I must first tell you that we've had some unexpected company at the Beiji. First, it was a single woman, then a couple. When I got back this afternoon, another couple. I paused for just an instant. They are Jews. Fred's expression did not change. We can provide safe places for these people, but they must provide something too. Ration cards. Fred's eyes smiled. So now I know why you came here. Fred, is there any way you can give out extra cards, more than you can report? Not at all, Corey. Those cards have to be accounted for a dozen ways. They're checked and double-checked. The hope that had begun to mount in me tumbled, but Fred was frowning. Unless, he began. Unless? Unless there should be a hold-up. The food office in Reich was robbed last month, but the men were caught. He was silent for a while. If it happened at noon, he said slowly. When just the record clerk and I are there, and if they found us tied and gagged, he snapped his fingers, and I knew just the man he said, I knew just the man who might do it. Do you remember don't, I said, remembering Willem's warning. Don't tell me who, don't tell me how, just get the cards if you possibly can. Fred stared at me a moment. How many do you need? I opened my mouth to say 5, but the number that unexpectedly and astonishingly came out instead was 100. When Fred opened the door to me just a week later, I gasped at the sight of him. Both eyes were greenish-purple, his lower lip cut and swollen. My friend took very naturally to the part, was all he would say. But he had the cards. On the table in a brown manila envelope were 100 passports to safety. Fred had already torn the continuing coupon from each. The final coupon was presented at the food office the last day of each month in exchange for the next month's card. With these coupons, Fred could legally continue to issue us 100 cards. We agreed that it would be risky for me to keep coming to his house each month. What if he were to come to the Beiji instead, dressed in his old meterman uniform? The meter in the Beiji was in the back hall, at the foot of the stairs. When I got home that afternoon, I pried up the tread of the bottom step as Peter had done, higher to hide the radio, and found a hollow space inside. Peter would be proud of me, I thought as I worked, and was flooded with a wave of lonesomeness for that brave and cocksure boy. But even he would have to admit, I concluded as I stepped back to at last to admire the completed hideaway, that a watchmaker's hand and eye were worth something. The hinge was hidden deep in the wood, the ancient riser undisturbed. I was ridiculously pleased with it. We had our first test of the system July 1st. Fred was to come in through the shop as he always had, carrying the cards beneath his shirt. He would come at 5:30, when Betsy would have the back hall free of callers. To my horror, 5:25, the shop door opened, and in stepped a policeman. He was a tall man, with close-cropped orange-red hair, whom I knew by name, Rolf van Vliet, but little else. He had come to the 100th birthday party for the Beiji for the clock shop, but so had half the force. Certainly he was not one of Betsy's regulars for winter morning coffee. Rolf had brought in a watch that needed cleaning, and he seemed in a mood to talk. My throat had gone dry, but Father chatted cheerfully as he took off the back of Rolf's watch and examined it. What were we going to do? There was no way to warn Fred Kornstra. Promptly at 5:30, the door of the shop opened, and he walked in, dressed in blue work clothes. It seemed to me that his chest was too thick by a foot at least. With magnificent aplomb, Fred nodded to Father, the policeman, and me, good evening. Courteous, but a little bored. He strode through the door at the rear of the shop and shut it behind him. My ears strained to hear him lift the secret lid. There. Surely Rolf must have heard it too. The door behind us opened again. So great was Fred's control that he had not ducked out the alleyway exit, but came strolling back through the shop. Good evening, he said again. Evening. He reached the street door and was gone. We had got away with it this time, but somehow, some way, we were going to have to work out a warning system. For meanwhile, in the weeks since Miss Claremaker's unexpected visit, a great deal had happened at the Beiji. Supplied with ration cards, Miss Claremaker and the elderly couple and the next arrivals, and the next, had found homes in safer locations. But still, the hunted people kept coming, and the needs were often more complicated than ration cards and addresses. If a Jewish woman became pregnant, where would she go to have her baby? If a Jew in hiding died, how could he be buried? Develop your own sources, Willem had said. And from the moment Fred Kornstra's name had popped into my mind, an uncanny realization had been growing in me. We were friends with half of Harlem. We knew nurses in the maternity hospital. We knew clerks in the records office. We knew someone in every business and service in the city. We didn't know, of course, the political views of all these people. But, and here I felt a strange leaping in my heart, God did. My job was simply to follow his leading, one step at a time, holding every decision up to him in prayer. I knew I was not clever or subtle or sophisticated. If the Beiji was becoming a meeting place for need and supply, it was through some strategy far higher than mine. A few nights after Fred's first meterman visit, the alley bell rang long after curfew. I sped downstairs, expecting another sad and stammering refugee. Betsy and I had already made up beds for 4 new overnight guests that evening, a Jewish woman and her 3 small children. But to my surprise, close against the wall of the dark alley stood Kik. Get your bicycle, he ordered with his unusual young abruptness, and put on a sweater. I have some people I want you to meet. Now? After curfew? But I knew it was useless to ask questions. Kik's bicycle was tireless too, the wheel rims swathed in cloth. He wrapped mine also to keep down the clatter, and soon we were pedaling through the blacked-out streets of Harlem at a speed that would have scared even me in daylight. "Put a hand on my shoulder," Kit whispered. "I know the way." We crossed the dark side streets, crested bridges, wheeled round invisible corners. At last we crossed a broad canal, and I knew we had reached the fashionable suburb of Erdenhout. We turned into a driveway beneath shadowy trees. To my astonishment, Kit picked up my bicycle and carried both his and mine up the front steps. A serving girl with starched white apron and ruffled cap opened the door. The entrance hall was jammed with bicycles. Then I saw him, one eye smiling at me, the other at the door, and his vast stomach hastening ahead of him. Pickwick! He led Kit and me into the drawing room, where sipping coffee and chatting in small groups was the most distinguished-looking group of men and women I had ever seen. But all my attention that first moment was on the inexpressibly fragrant aroma in that room. Surely, was it possible they were drinking real coffee? Pickwick drew me a cup from the silver urn on the sideboard. It was coffee. After 2 years, rich, black, pungent Dutch coffee. He poured himself a cup too, dropping in his usual 5 lumps of sugar, as though rationing had never been invented. Another starched and ruffled maid was passing a tray heaped high with cakes. Gobbling and gulping, I trailed about the room after Pickwick, shaking hands of the people he singled out. They were strange introductions, for no names were mentioned, only occasionally an address in "Asked for Mrs. Smith." When I had met my fourth Smith, Kit explained with a grin, "It's the only last name in the underground." So this was really and truly the underground? But where were these people from? I had never laid eyes on any of them. A second later, I realized with a shiver down my spine that I was meeting the national group. Their chief work, I gleaned from bits of conversation, was liaison with England and the Free Dutch forces fighting elsewhere on the continent. They also maintained the underground route through much downed Allied plane crews, reached the North Sea coast. But they were instantly sympathetic with my efforts to help Harlem Jews. I blushed to my hair roots to hear Pickwick describe me as the head of an operation here in this city. A hollow space under the stairs and some haphazard friendships were not an operation. The others here were obviously competent, disciplined, and professional. But they greeted me with grave courtesy, murmuring what they had to offer as we shook hands: false identity papers, the use of a car with official government plates, signature forgery. In a far corner of the room, Pickwick introduced me to a frail-appearing little man with a wispy goatee. "Our host informs me," the little man began formally, "that your headquarters building lacks a secret room. This is a danger for all, those you are helping as well as yourselves, and those who work with you. With your permission, I will pay you a visit in the coming week." Years later, I learned that he was one of the most famous architects in Europe. I knew him only as Mr. Smith. Just before Kit and I started our dash back to the Beiji, Pickwick slipped an arm through mine. "My dear, I have good news. I understand that Peter is about to be released." So he was. 3 days later, thinner, paler, and not a whit daunted by his 2 months in a concrete cell. Nollie, Tyne, and Betsy used up a month's sugar ration, baking cakes for his welcome home party. And one morning, soon afterward, the first customer in the shop was a small, thin-bearded man named Schmidt. Father took his jeweler's glass from his eye. If there was one thing he loved better than meeting a new acquaintance, it was discovering a link with an old one. "Schmidt," he said eagerly. "I know several Schmidts in Amsterdam. Are you by chance related to the family who—" "Father," I interrupted, "this is the man I told you about. He's come to inspect the house." "A building inspector? Then you must be the Schmidt with offices in the Groothuisstraat. I wonder that I haven't—" "Father," I pleaded, he's not a building inspector. And his name is not Schmidt." "Not Schmidt?" Together, Mr. Schmidt and I attempted to explain, but Father simply could not understand a person's being called by a name not his own. As I led Mr. Schmidt into the back hall, we heard him musing to himself. "I once knew a Schmidt on Koningstreet." Mr. Schmidt examined and approved the hiding place for ration cards beneath the bottom step. He also pronounced acceptable the warning system we had worked out. This was a triangle-shaped wooden sign advertising Alfina watches, which I had placed in the dining room window. As long as the sign was in place, it was safe to enter. But when I showed him a cubbyhole behind the corner cupboard in the dining room, he shook his head. Some ancient resigning of the house had left a crawl space in that corner, and we'd been secreting jewelry, silver coins, and other valuables there since the start of the occupation. Not only the rabbi had brought us his library, but other Jewish families had brought their treasures to the Beiji for safekeeping. The space was large enough that we had believed a person could crawl in there if necessary, but Mr. Schmidt dismissed it without a second glance. First place they would look. Don't bother to change it, though. It's only silver. We're interested in saving people, not things. He started up the narrow corkscrew stairs, and as he mounted, so did his spirits. He paused in delight at the odd place landings, pounded on the crooked walls, and laughed aloud as the floor levels of the two houses continued out of phase. "What an impossibility," he said with awestruck voice. "What an improbable, unbelievable, unpredictable impossibility. Miss Tim Boom, if all houses were constructed like this one, you would see before you a less worried man." At last, at the very top of the stairs, he entered my room and gave a little cry of delight. "This is it," he explained. "You want your hiding place as high as possible," he went on eagerly. "Gives you the best chance to reach it while the search is on below." He leaned out the window, craning his thin neck, the little fawn's beard pointing the way, this way and that. But this is my bedroom." Mr. Schmidt paid no attention. He was already measuring. He moved the heavy, wobbling old wardrobe away from the wall with surprising ease and pulled my bed into the center of the room. "This is where the false wall will go." Excitingly, he drew out a pencil and drew a line along the floor, 30 inches from the back of the wall. He stood up and gazed at it moodily. That's as big as I dare," he said. "It will take a cot mattress, though. Oh yes, easily." I tried again to protest, but Mr. Schmidt had forgotten I existed. Over the next few days, he and his workmen were in and out of our house constantly. They never knocked. At each visit, a man carried in something. Tools in a folded newspaper, a few bricks and a briefcase. "Wood," he explained, when I ventured to wonder if a wooden wall would not be easier to build. "Wood sounds hollow. Hear it in a minute. No, brick's the only thing for false walls." After the wall was up, the plasterer came, then the carpenter, finally the painter. 6 days after he had begun, Mr. Schmidt called Father, Betsy, and me to see. We stood in the doorway and gaped. The smell of fresh paint was everywhere, but surely nothing in this room was newly painted. all four walls. That streaked and grimy look that old room's got in coal-burning Harlem. The ancient molding ran unbroken around the ceiling, chipped and peeling here and there, obviously undisturbed for 150 years. Old water stains streaked the back wall, a wall that even I, who had lived half a century in this room, could scarcely believe was not the original, but set back a precious 2.5 feet from the true wall of the building. Built-in bookshelves ran along this false wall, old sagging shelves whose blistered wood bore the same water stains as the wall behind them. Down in the far left-hand corner beneath the bottom shelf, a sliding panel, 2 feet high, 2 feet wide, opened into the secret room. Mr. Smith stooped and silently pulled this panel up. On hands and knees, Betsy and I crawled into the narrow room behind it. Once inside, we could stand up, sit, or even stretch out one at a time on the single mattress. A concealed vent cunningly led into the real wall, allowing air to enter from outside. "Keep a water jug there," said Mr. Smith, crawling in behind us. "Change the water once a week. Hardtack and vitamins keep indefinitely. Anytime there is anyone in the house whose presence is unofficial, all possessions except the clothes actually on his back must be stored in here." Dropping to our knees again, we crawled single file out into my bedroom. "Move back into this room," he told me. "Everything exactly as before." With his fist, he struck the wall above the bookshelves. "The Gestapo could search for a year," he said. "They'll never find this one." End of chapter 6. The Hiding Place, chapter 7. You see. Peter was home, yet he was not safe, any more than any healthy young male was safe. In Germany, the munitions factories were desperate for workers. Without warning, soldiers would suddenly surround a block of buildings and sweep through them, herding every single male between 16 and 30 into trucks for transport. This method of lightning search and seizure was called the razzia, and every family with young men lived in dread of it. Flip and Nollie had rearranged their kitchen to give them an emergency hiding place as soon as the razzias started. There was a small potato cellar beneath the kitchen floor. They enlarged the trap door letting into it, put a large rug on top of it, and moved the kitchen table to stand on this spot. Since Mr. Smith's work at the Beiji, I realized that this hole under the kitchen floor was a totally inadequate hiding place. Too low in the house, for one thing, and probably, as Mr. Smith would say, the first place they'd look. However, it was not a sustained search by trained people it was intended for, but a swoop by soldiers, a place to get out of sight for half an hour. And for that, I thought, it was probably sufficient. It was Flip's birthday when the razzia came to that quiet residential street of identical attached homes. Father, Betsy, and I had come home early with a 1/4 pound of real English tea from Pickwick. Nollie, Elias, and the other 2 older girls were not yet back when we arrived. A shipment of men's shoes had been announced by one of the department stores, and Nollie had determined to get Flip a pair, if I have to stand in line all day. We were chatting in the kitchen with Cocky and Catrian when all at once Peter and his older brother Bob raced into the room, their faces white. "Soldiers! Quick! They're 2 doors down and coming this way." They jerked the table back, snatched away the rug, and tugged open the trap door. Bob lowered himself in first, lying flat down, and Peter tumbled in on top of him. We dropped the door shut, yanked the rug over it, and pulled the table back in place. With trembling hands, Betsy, Cocky, and I threw a long tablecloth over it and started laying 5 places for tea. There was a crash in the hall as the front door burst open, and a smaller crash close by as Cocky dropped a teacup. 2 uniformed Germans ran into the kitchen, rifles leveled. "Stay where you are. Do not move." We heard boots storming up the stairs. The soldiers glanced around disgustingly at this room filled with women and one old man. If they had looked closer at Katrine, she would surely have given herself away. Her face was a mask of terror. But they had other things on their minds. "Where are your young men?" The shorter soldier asked Cocky in clumsy, thick, accented Dutch. "These are my aunts," she said. "This is my grandfather. My father is at his school, and my mother is shopping, and—" "I didn't ask about the whole tribe," the man exploded in German. Then in Dutch, "Where are your brothers?" Cocky stared at him a second and then dropped her eyes. My heart stood still. I knew how Nollie had trained her children, but surely now of all times a lie was permissible. "Do you have brothers?" the officer asked again. "Yes," Cocky said softly. "We have 3. "How old are they?" 21, 19, and 18. Upstairs, we heard the sounds of doors opening and shutting, the scrape of furniture dragged from walls. "Where are they now?" the soldier persisted. Cocky leaned down and began gathering up the broken bits of the cup. The man jerked her upright. "Where are your brothers?" "The oldest one is at the theological college. He doesn't get home most nights because—" "What about the other 2? Cocky did not miss a breath. "Why, they're under the table." Motioning us all away from it with his gun, the soldier seized a corner of the tablecloth. At a nod from him, the taller man crouched with his rifle cocked. Then he flung back the cloth. At last the pent-up tension exploded. Cocky burst into spasms of high, hysterical laughter. The soldiers whirled around. Was this girl laughing at them? "Don't take us for fools," the short one snarled. Furiously he strode from the room, and minutes later the entire squad trooped out. Not, unfortunately, before the silent soldier spied and pocketed our precious pack of tea. It was a strange dinner party that evening, veering as it did from heartfelt thanksgiving to the nearest thing to a bitter argument our close-knit family had ever had. Nollie stuck by Cocky, insisting she would have answered the same way. God honors truth-telling with perfect protection. Peter and Bob, from the viewpoint of the trapdoor, weren't so sure, and neither was I. I had never had Nollie's bravery. No, nor her faith either. But I could spot illogic. And it isn't logical to say the truth and do a lie. What about Ananias's false papers and that maid's uniform on Katrine? "Set a watch, O Lord, before my mouth," Nollie quoted. "Keep the door of my lips," Psalm 141. And she finished triumphantly. "All right, what about the radio? I had to lie with my lips to keep that. And yet, whatever came from your lips, Corey, I'm sure it was spoken in love," Father's kindly voice reproached my flushed face. Love. Love. How did one show it? How could God himself show truth and love at the same time in a world like this? By dying. The answer stood out for me sharper and chiller than it ever had before that night. The shape of a cross, etched on the history of the world. It was getting harder and harder to find safe homes in the country for the scores of Jews who were passing through our underground station in early 1943. Even the ration cards and forged papers, there were not enough places for them all. Sooner or later, we knew we were going to have to start hiding people here in the city. How sad that the very first should have been the dearest of all. It was in the middle of a busy morning in the shop when Betsy slipped through the workshop door. "Harry and Kato are here," she said. We were surprised. Harry had never come to the Beiji in daytime because he feared his yellow star would cause awkwardness for us. Father and I hurried behind Betsy up the stairs. Harry DeVries related the familiar story. The visit the evening before from the NSB Quisling. The announcement that the shop was confiscated. Who cared if Harry were a Christian? Any Jew can convert to avoid trouble, the NSBer said. This morning, the appearance of a uniformed German to make it official. The shop was closed in the interest of national security. But if I'm a security risk, said poor Harry, surely they will not stop with taking my store. Doubtless they will not. But just then there was absolutely no available place outside the city. In fact, the only underground address we had at the moment was the home of a woman named de Boer, not 4 blocks from the Beiji. That afternoon, I knocked on Miss de Boer's door. She was a dumpy woman dressed in a blue cotton smock and bedroom slippers. We supplied Miss de Boer with ration cards, and she had arranged emergency appendectomy from there. She showed me the living quarters in her attic. 18 Jews were staying there, most of them in their early 20s. They've been cooped up too long, she said. They sing and dance and make all sorts of noise. If you think one more couple is too much, no, how can I turn them away? Bring them tonight, we'll manage. And so Harry and Kato began their life at Mrs. de Boer's, living in one of the narrow dormers in the attic. Betsy went every day to take them some homemade bread, a bit of tea, a slice of sausage. But Betsy's main concern was not for the morale of Harry and Kato, it was for their very lives. They're in danger, you know, she told Father and me. It's true that these young people are at the bursting point. This afternoon they were making such a commotion I could hear them down the street. There were other concerns. That bitter gray winter. Though there was little snow, the cold came early and stayed late, and fuel was scarce. Here and there in the parks and along the canals, trees began to disappear as people cut them down to heat cook stoves and fireplaces. The damp, unheated rooms were hardest on the very young and the very old. One morning, Christoffels did not appear for Bible reading in the dining room, nor later in the workshop. His landlady found him dead in his bed, and the water in his wash basin frozen solid. We buried the old clockmaker in the splendid suit and vest he had worn to the 100th birthday party for the Beiji, for the clock shop, 6 years ago, another lifetime ago. Spring came slowly. We celebrated my 51st birthday with a little party in the DeVries alcove home. It was 1 week later, April 22nd, that Kato arrived alone at the Beiji. Inside the door, she burst into tears. Those foolish young people went crazy. Last night, 8 of them left the house. Naturally, they were stopped and arrested. The boys hadn't even bothered to cut their sideburns. The Gestapo didn't have any trouble getting information out of them. The house had been raided, she said, at 4 a.m. Kato was released when they discovered she was not Jewish, but everyone else, Harry, Mrs. de Boer too. Oh, what will become of them? For the next 3 days, Kato was at the Haarlem police station from early morning until curfew, pestering Dutch and Germans alike to see her husband. When they sent her away, she stepped across the street and waited silently on the sidewalk. Friday, just before the noon closing, when the shop was crowded, a policeman pushed open the street door, hesitated, then continued into the rear room. It was Rolf van Vliet, the officer who had been here when our ration cards were delivered. He took off his cap, and I noticed again that startling orange-red hair. "This watch is still not keeping time," Rolf said. He took off his wristwatch, placed it on the workbench, and leaned forward. Was he saying something? It was all I could do to hear. "Harry DeVries will be taken to Amsterdam tomorrow. If you want to see him, come promptly at 3 this afternoon. And then, do you see, the second hand still hesitates at the top of the dial?" At 3 that afternoon, Katie and I stepped through the tall double doors of the police station. The police on duty at the time at the guard post was Rolf himself. "Come with me," he said gruffly. He led us through a door and along a high, ceilinged corridor. At a locked metal gate, he stopped. "Wait here," Rolf said. Someone on the other side opened the gate and Ross passed through. He was gone several minutes, then the door opened again and we were face to face with Harry. Rolf stood back as Harry took Kato into his arms. "You only have a few seconds," whispered Rolf. They drew apart, looking into each other's eyes. "I'm sorry," said Rolf. "I'm sorry. He'll have to go back." Harry kissed his wife. Then he took my hand and shook it solemnly. Tears filled his eyes. For the first time Harry spoke. "I shall use this place. Whenever they're taking us, wherever they're taking us," he said, "I shall use this place. It will be my witness stand for Jesus." Rolf took Harry by the elbow. "We will pray for you many times every day, Harry." I cried this as the gate swung shut. An instinct which I shared with no one told me this was the last time I would ever see our friend, the bulldog. That night, we held a meeting about Rolf. Betsy and I and the dozen or so teenage boys and girls who acted as messengers for this work. If Rolf had risked his own safety to tell us about Harry's transport, perhaps he should work with us. "Lord Jesus," I said aloud, "this could be a danger for us all, and for Rolf too." But even with the words came a flood of assurance about this man. How long, I wondered, will we be led by this gift of knowledge? I assigned one of our younger boys to follow Rolf home from work next day and learn where he lived. The other boys, the ones susceptible to the factory draft, we sent out only after dark now, and then most often they dressed as girls. The following week I visited Rolf at home. "You have no idea how much it meant to see Harry," I said, when I was safe inside. "How can we repay this kindness?" Rolf ran his hands through his bright hair. "Well, there is a way. The cleaning woman at the jail has a teenage son, and they've almost picked him up twice. She's desperate to find another place for him to live." "Perhaps I can help," I said. "Do you think she could find that her watch needs repairing?" The next day, twos came to the door of the Tanti Jan's room where I was talking with two new volunteers for our work. More and more I was leaving the watch shop to her and Father as our underground operation required more time. "There's a funny-looking woman downstairs," two said. "She says her name is Beiji. She says to tell you Rolf sent her." I met Beiji in the dining room. The hand that I shook was rigid and leathery from years of scrubbing floors. A tuft of hair grew from her chin. "I understand," I said, "that you have a son you're very proud of." "Oh, yes," Miss Beji's face lit up at the mention of him. I took the bulky old alarm clock she had brought with her. "Come for your clock tomorrow afternoon, and I'll hope to have good news." That night we listened to our messenger's report. The long, cruel winter had opened up places at several addresses. There was a place on a nearby tulip farm, but the farmer had decided he must be paid for the risk he was taking. We would have to provide a fee in silver riksdaler, not paper money, plus an additional ration card. It didn't happen often that a host would require money for his services, but when one did, we paid gladly. When Beiji appeared the following morning, I took a small banknote from my purse and tore off a corner. "This is for your son," I said. "Tonight, he is to go to the Graven Stekenberg. There is a tree stump right next to the bridge. They cut down the tree last winter. He is to wait beside it, looking into the canal. A man will come up and ask him if he has change for a bank bill. Your son is to match the missing corner, and then follow this man without asking questions." Betsy came into the dining room as Beiji was grasping my hand in her two sandpaper ones. "I'll make it up to you," Somehow, someday, I'll find a way to repay you." Betsy and I exchanged smiles. How could this simple little soul help with the kind of need we faced? And so the work grew. As each new need arose, a new answer was found too. Through Pickwick, for example, we met the man at the Central Telephone Exchange whose department handled orders to connect and disconnect lines. With a little rewiring and juggling of numbers, he soon had our instrument in operation. What a day it was when the old wall phone in the rear hall jangled joyously for the first time in 3 years. And how we needed it, for by now there were 80 Dutchmen, elderly women, and middle-aged men, along with their teenagers working in God's underground, and we sometimes laughingly called ourselves God's underground. Most of these people never saw one another. We kept face-to-face contacts as few as possible, but all knew the Beiji. It was headquarters, the center of a spreading web, the knot where all threads crossed. But if the telephone was a boon, it was also a fresh risk, as was each added worker in connection. We set the phone's ring as low as we could and still hear it, but who might happen to be passing through the hall when it rang? For that matter, how long would curious eyes up and down the street continue to believe that one small watch shop was quite as busy as it appeared? It was true that repair work was in demand. Plenty of legitimate customers still passed in and out, but there was altogether too much coming and going, especially in the early evening. The curfew was now at 7 p.m., which in spring and summer left no nighttime hours at all in which workers could move legally through the streets. It was an hour and a half before that time on the 1st of June, 1943, and I was thinking of all this as I sat impatiently behind my workbench. Six workers still not back, and so many loose ends to tie up before 7 p.m. For one thing, being the first of the month, Fred Kordstra could be arriving with the new ration cards. The 100 cards, which had seemed such an extravagant request a year ago, were now far too few for our needs, and Fred was only one of our suppliers. Some of the stolen cards coming as far away as Delft. How long can we go on this way, I wondered. How long can we continue to count on this strange protection? My thoughts were interrupted by the side entrance bell. Betsy and I reached it at the same time, the same instant. In the alley stood a young Jewish woman cradling a tiny blanketed bundle in her arms. Behind her I recognized an intern from the maternity hospital. The baby, he told us in the hallway, had come prematurely. He had kept mother and child in hospital longer than permitted already because she had nowhere else to go. Betsy held out her arms for the baby, and at that moment Fred Kordstra opened the door from the shop. He blinked a moment at seeing people in the hall, then turned with great deliberation to the meter on the wall. The young doctor, seeing what he took to be an actual meterman, turned as white as his own collar. I longed to reassure both him and Fred, but knew that the fewer of the group who knew one another, the safer it was for all. The poor intern gulped a hasty goodbye, while Betsy and I got mother and baby up to the dining room and closed the door on Fred and his work. Betsy poured a bowl of soup she had cooked for supper from a much-boiled bone. The baby began a thin, high wail. I rocked it while the mother ate. Here was a new danger, a tiny fugitive, too young to know the folly of making a noise. We had many Jewish children over a night or several nights at the Beiji, and even the youngest had developed the uncanny silence of small hunted things. But at 2 weeks, this one had yet to discover how unwelcoming was its world. We would need a place for them far removed from other homes. The very next morning into the shop walked the perfect solution. He was a clergyman friend of ours, pastor in a small town outside of Haarlem, and his home was set back from the street in a large wooded park. "Good morning, Pastor," I said. the pieces of the puzzle falling together in my mind. Can you help? I looked at the watch he had brought in for repair. It required a very hard-to-find spare part. But for you, Pastor, we will do our very best, and now I have something I want to confess. The pastor's eyes clouded. Confess? I drew him out the back door of the shop and up the stairs to the dining room. I confess that I am too searching for something. The pastor's face was now wrinkled with a frown. Would you be willing to take a Jewish mother and her baby into your home? They will almost certainly be arrested otherwise. Color drained from the man's face. He took a step back from me. Miss Tim Boom, I do hope you're not involved with any of this illegal concealment and undercover business. It's not safe. Think of your father and your sister. She's never been strong. On impulse, I told the pastor to wait and ran upstairs. Betsy had put the newcomers in Willem's old room, the farthest from the windows on the street. I asked the mother's permission to borrow the infant. The little thing weighed hardly anything in my arms. Back in the dining room, I pulled back the coverlet from the baby's face. There was a long silence. The man bent forward, his hand, in spite of himself, reaching for the tiny fist curled around the blanket. For a moment, I saw compassion and fear struggle in his face. Then he straightened. No, definitely not. We could lose our lives for that Jewish child. Unseen by either of us, Father had appeared in the doorway. Give the child to me, Corey, he said. Father held the baby close, his white beard brushing its cheek, looking into the little face with eyes as blue and innocent as the baby's own. At last, he looked up at the pastor. You say we could lose our lives for this child. I would consider that the greatest honor that could come to my family. The pastor turned sharply on his heels and walked out of the room. So he had to accept a bad solution to our problem. On the edge of Harlem was a truck farm which hid refugees for short periods of time. It was not a good location, since the Gestapo had already been there already. But there was nowhere else available on short notice. 2 workers took the woman and child there that afternoon. A few weeks later, we heard that the farm had been raided. When the Gestapo came to the barn where the woman was hidden, not the baby, but the mother began to shriek with hysteria. She and the baby and her protectors were all taken. We never learned what happened to them. Although we had a friend at the telephone exchange, we could never be sure that our line was not tapped. So we developed a system for coding our underground messages in terms of watches. We have a woman's watch here that needs repairing, but I can't find a mainspring. Do you know who might have one? We have a Jewish woman in need of a hiding place, and we can't find one among our regular contacts, was what that one meant. Another one. I have a watch here with a face that's causing difficulty. One of the numbers has worked loose and it's holding back the hand. Which is, do you know anyone who does this kind of repair work? We have a Jew here whose features are especially Semitic. Do you know anyone who would be willing to take an extra risk? Or another one. I'm sorry, but the child's watch you left with us is not repairable. Do you have the receipt? Which means a Jewish child has died in one of our houses. We need a burial permit. One morning in the middle of June, the telephone rang with this message. We have a man's watch here that's giving us trouble. We can't find anyone to repair it. For one thing, the face is very old-fashioned. So, a Jew whose features gave him away. This was the hardest kind of person to place. Send the watch over, and I'll see what we can do in our shop, I said. Promptly at 7 that evening, the sideboard doorbell rang. I glanced at the mirror in the window of the dining room where we were still sitting over tea of rose leaves and cherry stems. Even from the side of his head, I could tell that this was our old-fashioned watch. His form, his clothes, his very stance were music hall comedy Jewish. I ran down to the door. Do come in. The smiling, slender man in his early 30s, with his protruding ears, balding head, and minuscule glasses, gave an elaborate bow. I liked him instantly. Once the door was closed, he took out a pipe. "The very first thing I must ask," he said, "is whether or not I should leave behind my good friend the pipe. Meyer Mulser and his pipe are not easily separated, but for you, kind lady, should the smell get into your drapes, I would gladly say good-bye to my friend nicotine." I laughed. All of the Jews who had come to our house, this was the first to enter gaily with a question about our own comfort. "Of course you must keep your pipe," I said. "My father smokes a cigar when we can get one these days." "Ah, these days." Mayor Mosul raised his arms and shoulders in an enormous shrug. "What do you expect when the barbarians have overrun the camp?" I took him up to the dining room. There were 7 seated at the table, a Jewish couple waiting placement and 3 underground workers in addition to Father and Betsy. Mayor Mosul's eyes went straight to Father. "But," he cried, "one of the patriarchs." It was exactly the right thing to say to Father, but he returned with equal good humor. "A brother of the chosen people." It was exactly the right thing to say to Father, but he returned with equal good humor. "A brother of the chosen people. Can you recite the 166th Psalm, Opa?" Meyer said. Father beamed. "Of course there's no 166th Psalm. The Psalmster stops at 150. It must be a joke. And nothing could please Father better than a scriptural joke. The 166th Psalm? I'll recite it for you," Meyer asked. Father gave a bow of assent, and Meyer plunged into the verse. "But that's Psalm 100, Father interrupted, and then his face lit up. "Of course. Psalm 66 started with the identical words." Myers had asked for the 100 and the 66th Psalm. For the rest of the evening I could hear Father chuckling. 166. At 8:45, Father took the old brass-bound Bible from its shelf. He opened to the reading in Jeremiah where we had left off the night before, then with sudden inspiration passed the Bible across the table to Meyer. "I would consider it an honor if you would read for us tonight," Father said. Lifting the book lovingly, Meyer rose to his feet. From a pocket came a small prayer cap, and then from deep within his throat, half sung, half pleaded, came the words of the ancient prophet, so fillingly and achingly that we seemed to hear the cry of the exile itself. Meyer Mosul, he told us afterwards, had been cantor in the synagogue in Amsterdam. For all his light-heartedness, he had suffered much. Most of his family had been arrested. His wife and children were hiding on a farm in the north, which had been declined to accept Meyer for obvious reasons, he said, with a grimace at his own unmistakable features. And gradually it dawned on all of us that this endearing man was at the Beiji to stay. It was certainly not an ideal place, but for Meyer, nothing else could be ideal right now. At least, I told him one evening, your name doesn't have to give you away too. Ever since the days when Willem was studying church history, I remembered the venerable 14th century church father, Eusebius. "I think we'll call you Eusebius," I decided. We were sitting in Tonty John's front room with Kick and some other young men who had made a delivery of forged travel permits, too late to get home by curfew. Meyer leaned back and stared at the ceiling pensively. He took his pipe out of his mouth. "Eusebius Mosul," he said, tasting the words. "No, it doesn't sound quite right. Eusebius Gentile Mosul." We all laughed. "Don't be a goose," Betsy said. "You must change both names." Kick looked slyly at Father. "Opa, how about Schmidt?" "That seems a popular name these days." "It does seem so," said Father, not catching the joke. "Extraordinarily popular." And Eusebius Schmidt it became. Changing Meyer's name was easy. At once he became Yusi. But getting Yusi to eat non-kosher food was something else. The problem, of course, was that we were grateful for food of any kind. We stood in line for hours, this 3rd year of occupation, to get whatever was available. One day the paper announced that coupon number 4 was good for pork sausage. It was the first meat we'd had in weeks. Lovingly, Betsy prepared the feast. saving every drop of fat for flavoring other foods later. "You see," Betsy said as she carried the steaming casserole of pork and potatoes to the table, "the day has come." Yusei knocked the ashes out of his pipe and considered his plight out loud. He who has always eaten kosher, he, the oldest son of a respected family, in fact, he, Meyer Mosel Eucubus Schmidt, was seriously being asked to eat pork? Betsy placed a helping of sausage and potato before him. Bon appetit. The tantalizing odor reached our meat-starved palates. Yusei wet his lips with his tongue. "Of course," he said. "There's a provision for this in the Talmud." He speared the meat with his fork, bit hungrily, and rolled his eyes heavenward in pure pleasure. "I'm going to start hunting for it, too," he said, "just as soon as dinner's over." As Yusei's arrival had broken down at last hesitation, within a week there were 3 new permanent additions to the household. First there was Job, our current apprentice, whose daily trip from his parents' home in the suburbs had twice nearly ended in seizure for the factory transport. The second time it happened, his parents asked if he could stay at the Beiji, and we agreed. The other 2 were Hink, a young lawyer, and Linder, a schoolteacher. Linder made an especially important contribution to the secret life of the Beiji. He installed our electric warning system. By now I had learned to make the nighttime trip out to Pickwick's almost as skillfully as could kick. One evening when I had gratefully accepted a cup of coffee, my walled-eyed friend sat me down for a lecture. "Cornelia," he said, settling in his bulk on a velvet chair too small for him, "I understand you have no alarm system in your house. This is pure folly. Also, I'm given to believe that you are not carrying on regular drills for your guests." I was always amazed at how well Pickwick knew what went on at the Beiji. "You know that a raid may come any day," Pickwick continued. "I don't see how you can avoid one. Scores of people in and out, and an NSB agent living over at Khan's up the street. Your secret room is no good to you if people can't get into it in time. I know this Linder. He's a good man and a very passable electrician. Get him to put a buzzer in every room with a door or a window on the street. Then hold practice drills until your people can disappear into that room without a trace in less than a minute. I'll send someone to get you started." Linder did the electrical work that weekend. He installed a buzzer near the top of the stairs, loud enough to be heard all over the house, but not outside. Then he placed buttons to sound the buzzer at every vantage point where trouble might be spotted. One button went beneath the dining room window sill, just below the mirror, which gave onto the side door. Another went in the downstairs hall just beside the door, and a third inside the front door of the Bartel, Jorstraat. We also put a button behind the counter in the shop and one in the workbench, as well as beneath the windows in Tonty John's rooms. We were ready for our first trial run. The 4 unacknowledged members of our household were already climbing up into the secret room 2 times in a day. In the morning to store their night clothes, bedding, and toilet articles, and in the evening to put away their day things. Members of our group, too, who had to spend the night, kept raincoats, hats, anything they had brought with them in that room. Altogether, that made a good deal of traffic in and out of my small bedroom. Smaller now, indeed, by nearly a yard. Many nights my last waking sight would be Yusei in long robe and tasseled nightcap, handing his day clothes through the secret panel. But the purpose of the drills was to see how rapidly people could reach the room at any hour of the day or night without prior notice. A tall, sallow-faced young man arrived from Pickwick one morning to teach me how to conduct the drills. "Schmidt," Father explained when the man introduced himself. "That is truly astonishing. We've had one Schmidt after another here lately." "Now, you bear a great resemblance to—" Mr. Schmidt disentangled himself gently from Father's genealogical inquiries and followed me upstairs. "Meal times," he said. "That's a favorite hour for a raid. Also the middle of the night." He strode from room to room, pointing everywhere to evidence that more than 3 people lived in the house. "Watch wastebaskets and ashtrays." He paused in a bedroom door. If the raid comes at night, they must not only take their sheets and blankets, but get the mattresses turned. Get the mattress turned, that's the SD's favorite trick, feeling for a warm spot on the bed. Mr. Smith stayed for lunch. There were 11 of us at the table that day, including a Jewish lady who had arrived the night before, and a Gentile woman with her small daughter, members of our underground who acted as escorts. The 3 of them were leaving for a farm in Brabant right after lunch. Betsy had just passed around a stew so artfully prepared you'd scarcely miss the meat when, without warning, Mr. Smith leaned back in his chair and pushed the button below the window. Above us, the buzzer sounded. People sprang to their feet, snatching up glasses and plates, scrambling for the stairs, while the cat clawed halfway up the curtain in consternation. Cries of, "Faster! Not so loud! You're spilling it!" reached us as Father, Betsy, and I hastily rearranged table and chairs to look like a lunch for 3 in progress. "No, leave my place," Mr. Smith instructed. "Why shouldn't you have a guest for lunch?" The lady and the little girl could have stayed too. At last, we were seated again and silence reigned upstairs. The whole process had taken 4 minutes. A little later, we were all gathered again around the dining room table. Mr. Smith set out before him the incriminating evidence he had found. 2 spoons, and a piece of carrot on the stairs. Pipe ashes in the unoccupied bedroom. Everyone looked at Usi, who blushed at the tips of his large ears. Also those, he pointed out to the hats of the mother and daughter still dangling from the pegs on the dining room wall. If you have to hide, stop and think what you arrived with, besides which you're all simply too slow. The next night I sounded the alarm again, and this time we shaved 1 minute and 33 seconds off our run. By our 5th trial, we were down to 2 minutes. We never did achieve Pickwick's ideal of under a minute, but with practice we learned to jump up from whatever we were doing and get those who had hid into the secret room in 70 seconds. Father, Tews, and I worked on stalling techniques, which we could use if the Gestapo came through the shop door. Betsy invented a similar strategy for the side door. With these delaying tactics, we hoped we could gain a life-saving 70 ticks of a second hand. Because the drills struck so close to the fear which haunted each of our guests, never spoken, always present, we tried to keep these times from becoming altogether serious. Like a game, we tell each other, a race to beat our own record. One of our group owned the bakery in the next street. Early in the month, I would deposit a supply of sugar coupons with him. Then when I decided it was time for a drill, I would go to him for a bag of cream puffs. An inexpressible treat in these sweetless days, to be secreted in my workbench and brought out as a reward for successful practice. Each time the order of cream puffs got larger, for by now, in addition to the workers whom we wanted to initiate into the system, we had 3 more permanent boarders, Thea, DaCosta, Metamasata, and Mary Italia. Mary Italia, at 76, the oldest of our guests, was also the one who posed the greatest problem. The moment Mary stepped through the door, I heard the asthmatic wheezing, which had made other hosts unwilling to take her in. Since her ailment compromised the safety of others, we took up the problem in caucus. The 7 most concerned, Yusi, Jop, Hink, Lindert, Meta, Thea, and Mary herself, joined Father, Betsy, and me in Tonty John's front room. "There is no sense in pretending," I began. "Mary has a difficulty, especially after climbing stairs that could put you all in danger." In the silence that followed, Mary's labored breathing seemed especially loud. "Can I speak?" Yusi asked. "Of course. It seems to me that we're all here in your house because of some difficulty or another. We're the orphan children, the ones nobody else wanted. Any of us is jeopardizing all the others. I vote that Mary stay." "Good," said Lawyer Hink. "Let's put it to the vote." Hands began rising, but Mary was struggling to speak. "Secret ballots," she brought out at last. "No one should be embarrassed." Hank brought out a sheet of paper from the desk in the next room and tore it into 9 small strips. "You two," he said, handing ballots to Betsy, Father, and me. "If we're discovered, you suffer the same with us." He handed around pencils, marked "No," if it's too great a risk. Yes, if you think she belongs here. For a moment, pencil sketched, then Hint collected the folded ballots. He opened them in silence and then reached over and dropped them in Mary's lap. 9 little scraps of paper, 9 times the word yes. And so our family was formed. Others stayed with us a day or a week, but these 7 remained, the nucleus of our family household. That it could have been happy at such a time and in such a circumstance was largely a tribute to Betsy. Because our guests' physical lives were so very restricted, evenings under Betsy's direction became the door to the wide world. Sometimes we had concerts with Leonard on the violin, Thea, a truly accomplished musician, on the piano, or Betsy would announce an evening of Vondel, the Dutch Shakespeare, with each of us reading a part. One night a week she talked Usi into giving Hebrew lessons. Another night Mata taught Italian. The evening's activities had to be kept brief because the city now had electricity only a short while each night. The candles had to be hoarded for emergencies. When the lamps flickered and dimmed, we would wind back down to the dining room where my bicycle was set up on its stand. One of us would climb onto it, and the others taking chairs. And then while the rider pedaled furiously to make the headlight glow bright, someone would pick up the chapter from the night before. We changed cyclists and readers as often as legs or voice grew tired, reading our way through history, novels, plays. Father always went upstairs after prayers at 9:15, but the rest of us lingered, reluctant to break the cycle, sorry to see the evening end. Oh well, Lucy would say hopefully as we started at last to our rooms. Maybe there'll be a drill tonight. I haven't had a cream puff in nearly a week. End of chapter 7. The Hiding Place, Chapter 8. Storm Clouds Gather. If evenings were pleasant, daytimes grew increasingly tense. We were too big. The group was too large. The web too widespread. For a year and a half now, we had gotten away with our double lives. Ostensibly, we were still an elderly watchmaker living with his 2 spinster daughters above his tiny shop. In actuality, the Beiji was the center of the underground ring that spread now to the farthest corners of Holland. Here daily came dozens of workers, reports, appeals. Sooner or later, we were going to make a mistake. It was mealtimes especially when I was worried. There were so many now for every meal that we had to set chairs diagonally around the dining room table. The cat loved this arrangement. Yusi had given him the Hebrew name Mahil Shalil Hatbach, meaning, appropriately enough, hastening to the spoils, hurrying to the prey. With the chairs set so close to Imesh Hashbats could circle the entire table on our shoulders, purring furiously, traveling around and around. But it was uneasy at being as many. The dining room was only 5 steps above the street level. A small passerby could see right in the window. We hung a white curtain across it, providing a kind of screen, while letting in light. Still, only when the heavy blackout shades were drawn at night did I feel truly private. At lunch one day, looking through the thin curtain, I thought I saw a figure standing just outside in the alley. When I looked again a minute later, it was still there. There was no reason for anyone to linger there, unless he was curious about what went on at the Beiji. I got up and parted the curtain an inch. Standing a few feet away, seemingly immobilized by some terrible emotion, was old Katrine from Nollie's house. I bolted down the stairs, threw open the door, pulled her inside. Although that August day was hot, the old lady's hands were cold as ice. "Katrine, what are you doing here? Why are you just standing there?" "She's gone mad," she sobbed. "Your sister's gone mad." "Nollie? Oh, what's happened?" "They came," she said. "The SD. I don't know what they knew or who told them. Your sister and Annelias were in the living room, and I heard her." The sobs broke out again. "I heard her." "Heard what?" I nearly screamed. heard what she told them. They pointed to Annelius and said, "Is this a Jew?" And your sister said, "Yes." I felt my knees go weak. Annelius, blonde, beautiful young Annelius with the perfect papers. And she trusted us. Oh, Nollie, Nollie, what was your rigid honesty? What has your rigid honesty done? And then, I asked. I don't know. I ran out the back door. She's gone mad. I left Katrina in the dining room, wheeled my bicycle down the stairs, and bumped out as fast as I could the 1.5 miles to Nollie's. Today, the sky did not seem larger above the wagon wheel. At the corner of the Bossenhavenstraat, I leaned my bike against a lamppost and stood panting, my heart throbbing in my throat. Then, as casually as I was able, I strolled up the sidewalk toward the house. Except for a car parked at the street curb directly in front, everything looked deceptively normal. I walked past, not a sound from behind the whitened curtains, nothing to distinguish this house from the replicas of it on the other side. When I got to the corner, I turned around. At that moment, the door opened and Nollie came out. Behind her walked a man in a brown business suit. A minute later, a second man appeared, half pulling, half supporting Annelius. The young woman's face was white as chalk. Twice before they reached the car, I thought she would faint. The car door slammed, the motor roared, and they were gone. I pedaled back to the Beiji, fighting back tears of anxiety. Nollie, we soon learned, had been taken to the police station around the corner to one of the cells and back. But Annelius had been sent to the old Jewish theater in Amsterdam, from which Jews were transported to extermination camps in Germany and Poland. It was Beiji, stooped, careworn little Beiji, whose offer of help we had discounted, who kept in touch with Nollie. She was in wonderful spirits, Beiji said, singing hymns and songs in her high, sweet soprano. How could she sing when she had betrayed another human being? Beiji delivered the bread that Betsy baked for Nollie each morning, and the blue sweater Nollie asked for, her favorite, with flowers embroidered over the pocket. Beiji relayed another message from Nollie, one especially for me. No ill will happen to Annelius. God will not let them take her to Germany. He will not let her suffer because I obeyed him. 6 days later, after Nollie's arrest, the telephone rang. Pickwick's voice was on the other end. I wonder, my dear, if I could trouble you to deliver that watch yourself. A message, then, that he could not relay on the phone. I biked at once out to Aberndonk, taking along a man's watch for safe measure. Pickwick waited until we were in the drawing room with the door shut. The Jewish theater in Amsterdam was broken into last night. 40 Jews were rescued. One of them, a young woman, was most insistent that Nollie know Annelius is free. He fixed me with one of his wide-set eyes. Do you understand this message? I nodded, too overcome with relief to speak joy. How had Nollie known? How had she been so sure? After 10 days in the Haarlem jail, Nollie was transferred to the federal prison in Amsterdam. Pickwick said that the German doctor in charge of the prison hospital was a humane man who occasionally arranged a medical discharge. I went at once to Amsterdam to see him, but what could I say, I wondered, as I waited in the entrance hall of his home? How could I get into the good graces of this man? Lolling about in the foyer, sniffing from time to time at my legs and hands, were 3 perfectly huge Doberman pinschers. I remembered the book we were reading aloud by a bicycle lamp, How to Win Friends and Influence People. One of the techniques advocated by Dale Carnegie was, find the man's hobby. Hobby. Dogs, I wonder. At last the maid returned and showed me into a small sitting room. How smart of you, doctor, I said in German to the grizzle-haired man on the sofa. Smart? Yes, to bring these lovely dogs with you. They must be good company when you have to be away from your family. The doctor's face brightened. You like dogs, then? About the only dogs I have ever known were Harry DeVry's bulldogs. Bulls were my favorite. Do you like bulls? People don't realize it, the doctor said eagerly, but bulldogs are very affectionate. For perhaps in 10 minutes, while I racked my brain for everything I could have ever heard or read on the subject. We talked about dogs. Then abruptly the doctor stood up. But I am sure you haven't come here to talk about dogs. What's on your mind? I met his eye. I have a sister in prison here in Amsterdam. I was wondering if... I don't think she's well. The doctor smiled. So you're not interested in dogs at all? I'm interested now, I said, smiling too. But I'm far more interested in my sister. What's her name? Nollie Van Warden. The doctor went out of the room and came back in with a brown notebook. Yes, one of the recent arrivals. Tell me something about her. What is she in prison for? Taking a chance, I told the doctor that Nollie's crime had been hiding a Jew. I told him that she was the mother of 6 children who, if left without aid, would become a burden to the state. I did not mention that the youngest of these children was now 17. Well, we'll see. He walked to the door of the sitting room. You must excuse me now. I was more encouraged than at any time since Nollie's arrest as I rode the train back to Haarlem, but days, then a week. When 2 weeks passed and there was no further news, I went back to Amsterdam. I've come to see how those Dobermans are, I told the doctor. He was not amused. You mustn't bother me. I know that you have not come to talk about dogs. You must give me time. So there was nothing to do but wait. It was a bright September noon when 17 of us were squeezed around the dining room table. All of a sudden, Niles, seated across from me, turned pale. Niles, one of our workers, had come to report old Katrien safely arrived at a farm north of Alkmaar. Now Niles spoke in a low, normal voice. Do not turn around. Someone is looking over the curtain. Over the curtain? But that was impossible. We'd have to be 10 feet high. The table fell silent. He's on a ladder. Washing the window, Niles said. I didn't order the windows washed, said Betsy. Whoever it was, we mustn't sit here in this frozen, guilty silence. Lucy had an inspiration. Happy birthday, he sang. Happy birthday to you. We all got the idea and joined in lustily. Happy birthday, dear Opa. The song was still echoing through the Beiji when I went out the side door and stood next to the ladder, looking up at the man holding bucket and sponge. What are you doing? We didn't want the windows washed, especially not during the party. The man took a piece of paper from his hip pocket and consulted it. Isn't this Cooper's? They're across the street. But anyhow, come in and help us celebrate. The man shook his head. He thanked me, but he had work to do. I watched him cross to the Bartelstraat and his ladder to Cooper's candy store. Did it work? A clamor of voices asked when I got back to the dining room. Do you think he was spying? I didn't answer. I didn't know. That was the hardest, never knowing. And one of the biggest unknowns was my own performance under questioning. As long as I was awake, I felt fairly sure of myself. But if they should come at night? Over and over again, the group worked with me. Niles, Hank, Lindbergh, bursting into my room without warning, shaking me awake, hurling questions at me. The first time it happened, I was sure the real raid had come. There was a terrific pounding on my door, and then a beam of a flashlight in my eyes. Get up, get on your feet. I could not see the man who was speaking. Where are you hiding your 9 Jews? We only have 6 Jews now. There was an awful silence. The room light came on to show Rolf clutching his head in his hands. Oh no, he kept saying. It can't be this bad. Think now, said Henk just behind him. The Gestapo is trying to trap you. The answer is, what Jews? We don't have Jews here. Can I try again? Not now, said Rolf. You're wide awake now. Then he tried a few nights later. The Jews you're hiding, where do they come from? I sat up groggily. I don't know. They just come to the door. Rolf flung his hat to the floor. No, he shouted. What Jews? There are no Jews. Can you learn? I'll learn, I promised. I'll do better. And sure enough, the next time, I woke a little more completely. Half a dozen shadowy forms filled the room. Where do you hide the ration cards? A voice demanded. Under the bottom stair, of course, but this time I would not be trapped into saying so. A crafty reply occurred in me. The Frisian clock on the stairwell. Kit sat on the bed beside me and put an arm around me. That was better, Tontikori, he said. You tried this time, but remember, you have no cards, except for the 3 for you, Opa, and Tonti Betsy. There is no underground activity here. You don't understand what they're talking about. Gradually, with repeated drills, I got better. Still, when the time actually came, when there were real Gestapo agents really trained in getting the truth from people, how would I perform? Willem's underground work brought him frequently to Haarlem. There was an expression of something like despair mingled now with the worry lines in his face. Twice soldiers had been to the nursing home, and although he had managed to deceive them about most of the Jews still in residence there, one sick, blind old woman had been taken away. 91, William kept saying. She couldn't even walk. They had to carry her to the car. So far, Willem's position as a minister had prevented direct action against him and Tyne, but he was watched, he said, more closely than ever. To provide an official reason for his visits to Haarlem, he started conducting a weekly prayer fellowship at the Beiji each Wednesday morning. But Willem could do nothing routinely, especially pray, and soon the meeting was attended by a dozen of Haarlemers hungry for something better to believe in, this 4th year of the occupation. Most of those coming to the services had no idea of the double life of the Beiji. In a way, they posed a fresh danger as they passed workers and couriers from other underground groups coming and going on the narrow stairs, but in another way we thought it might be an advantage to have these flocks of obviously innocent people in and out. That, at least, was our hope. We were sitting around the supper table after curfew one night, the 10 booms, the 7 permanent guests, and 2 Jews for whom we were seeking homes, when the doorbell chimed. A customer after closing, and one bold enough to stand on the bordures after curfew. Taking the keys from my pocket, I hurried down to the hall, unlocked the workshop door, and felt my way through the dark store. At the front door, I listened a moment. Who's there? I called. Do you remember me? A man's voice speaking German. Who is it? I asked in the same language. An old friend come for a visit. Open the door. I fumbled with the lock and drew the door gingerly back. It was a German soldier in uniform. Before I could reach the alarm button behind the door, he had pushed his way inside. Then he took off his hat, and in the October twilight I recognized the young German watchmaker whom Father had discharged 4 years ago. Otto, I cried. Captain Alschuler, he corrected me. Our positions are slightly reversed, Miss Ten Boom, are they not? I glanced at his insignia. He was not a captain or anything close to it, but I said nothing. He looked around the shop. Same stuffy little place, he said. He reached for the wall switch, but I put my hand over it. No, we don't have blackout shades in the shop. Well, let's go upstairs where we can talk over old times. That old clock cleaner still around? Christoffels? He died in the fuel shortage last winter. Otto shrugged. Good riddance, then. What about the pompous old Bible reader? I was edging my way to the sales counter where another bell was located. Father is very well, thank you. Well, aren't you going to invite me to pay my respects? Why was he so eager to go upstairs? Had the wretched fellow come just to gloat, or did he suspect something? My finger found the button. What was that? Otto whirled around suspiciously. What was what? That sound. I heard a kind of buzzing. I didn't hear anything, but Otto had started back through the workshop. Wait, I shouted. Let me get the front door locked and I'll go up with you. I want to see how long it takes them to recognize you. I dawdled at the door as long as I dared. Definitely his suspicions were aroused. Then I followed him through the rear. door into the hall, not a sound from the dining room or the stairs. I dashed past him up the stairs and rapped on the door. "Father! Betsy!" I cried in what I was hopeful a playful voice. "I'll give you 6 guesses who's standing here. No guessing games." Otto reached past me and flung open the door. Father and Betsy looked up from their meal. The table was set for 3. My unfinished plate on the other side. It was so perfect that even I, who had just seen 12 people sitting here, could scarcely believe this was anything but an innocent old man dining with his daughters. The Alfina sign stood on the sideboard. They had remembered everything. Uninvited, Otto pulled out a chair. "Well," he growled, "things happened just like I said, didn't they?" "So it would seem," said Father mildly. "Betsy," I said, "give Captain Oshler some tea." Otto took a sip of the brew Betsy poured him and glared around the table at us. "Where did you get real tea? No one else in Holland has tea." How stupid of me. The tea had come from Pickwick. "If you must know," I said, "it comes from a German officer. But you mustn't ask any further questions." I tried to imply clandestine dealings with a high occupation official. Clandestine dealings with a high occupation official. Otto lingered another 15 minutes, and then, feeling perhaps that he had underlined his victory sufficiently, sauntered out into the empty streets. It was only after another half hour that we dared give all the clear to 9 cramped and shaky people. The second week in October, during a particularly hectic morning with the underground problems, the secret telephone number rang downstairs in the hall. I hurried to pick it up. Only Father and Betsy I ever answered it. "Well," said a voice, "aren't you coming to pick me up?" It was Nollie. "Nollie, how are you? Where are you?" "At the train station in Amsterdam, only I have no money for the train fare." "Stay right there." "Oh, Nollie, we're coming." I biked to Bossenhovenstraat and then, with Flip and the children who happened to be at home, hurried to Haarlem station. We saw Nollie even before our train came to a stop in Amsterdam, her bright blue sweater like a patch of blue sky in the big dark shed. 7 weeks in prison had left her pale-faced, but as radiantly Nollie as ever. A prison doctor, she said, had pronounced her low blood pressure a serious condition. One night might leave her permanently disabled and her 6 children a burden to society. Her wrinkled face in puzzlement as she said it. Christmas, 1943, was approaching. The light snow which had fallen was the only festive quality of the season. Every family, it seemed, had someone in jail, in a work camp, or in hiding. For once, the religious side of the holidays was uppermost in every mind. At the Beiji, we had not only Christmas to celebrate, but also Hanukkah, the Jewish festival of lights. Betsy found a Hanukkah candle stand among the treasures stored with us behind the dining room cupboard and set it on the upright piano. Each night we lighted one more candle as Yusi read the story of the Maccabees. Then we would sing, haunting, melancholy desert music. We were all very Jewish those evenings. About the 5th night of the festival, we were all gathered around the piano. The doorbell of the alley rang. I opened it to find Mrs. Bookers, wife of the optician next door, standing in the snow. Mrs. Bookers was round and placid, as her husband was thin and worried, but tonight her plump face was twisted with anxiety. "Do you think," she whispered, "your Jews could sing a little more softly? We can hear them right through the walls, and, well, there are all kinds of people on the street." Back in Tonty John's room, we reconsidered this news in consternation. If the Bookers family knew all about our affairs, how many other people in Haarlem did know? It wasn't long before we discovered that one who did was the chief of police himself. One dark January morning, when it was trying to snow again, twos burst into underground headquarters, and Tonty John's rear room clutched a letter in her hand. The envelope bore the seal of the Haarlem police. I tore it open. Inside the police chief's stationery was a handwritten note. I read it silently, then aloud. "You will come to my office this afternoon at 3 o'clock. For 20 minutes we arrived to analyze that note." For 20 minutes we tried to analyze that note. Some felt it was not a prey to arrest. Why would the police give you a chance to escape? Still, it was safest to prepare for search and imprisonment. Workers slipped out of the house, one at a time. Boarders emptied the wastebaskets and picked up scraps of sewing in preparation for a quick flight to the secret room. I burned incriminating papers in the long, empty coal hearth in the dining room. The cat caught the tension in the air and sulked beneath the sideboard. Then I took a bath, perhaps the last one for months, and packed a prison bag according to what Nollie and others had learned. A Bible, a pencil, needle and thread, soap, or what we called soap these days, toothbrush, and comb. I dressed in my warmest clothes with several sets of underwear and a second sweater beneath the top one. Just before 3 o'clock, I hugged Father and Betsy tight. I walked through the gray slush to the Smeedstraat. The policeman on duty was an old acquaintance. He looked at the letter, then at me with a curious expression. "This way," he said. He knocked at a door marked Chief. The man who sat behind the desk had red-gray hair combed forward over a bald spot. A radio was playing. The chief reached over and twisted the volume knob. Not down, but up. "Miss Ten Boom," he said. "Welcome." "How do you do, sir?" The chief had left his desk to shut the door behind me. "Do sit down," he said. "I know all about you, you know, about your work." "The watchmaking, you mean? You're probably thinking more about my father's work than my own." The chief smiled. "No, I mean your other work." "Ah, then you're referring to my work with retarded children?" "Yes, let me tell you about that." "No, Miss Ten Boom." The chief lowered his voice. "I am not talking about your work with retarded children. I'm talking about still another work, and I want you to know that some of us here are in sympathy." The chief was smiling broadly now. Tentatively, I smiled back. "Now, Miss Ten Boom," he went on, I have a request." The chief sat down on the edge of his desk and looked at me steadily. He dropped his voice until it was just audible. He was, he said, working with the underground himself, but an informer in the police department was leaking information to the Gestapo. "There's no way for us to deal with this man but to kill him." A shudder went down my spine. "What alternative have we?" the chief went on in a whisper. "We can't arrest him. There are no prisons except those controlled by the Germans. But if he remains at large, many others will die. That is why I wondered, Miss Ten Boom, if in your work you might know of someone who could—" "Kill him?" "Yes." I leaned back. Was this all a trap to trick me into admitting the existence of a group? Into naming names? "Sir," I said at last, seeing the chief's eyes flickered impatiently, "I have always believed that it was my role to save life, not destroy it. I understand your dilemma, however, I have a suggestion. Are you a praying man?" "Aren't we all these days?" "Then let us pray together now that God will reach the heart of this man so that he does not continue to betray his countrymen." There was a long pause. Then the chief nodded. "That I would very much like to do. That I would very much like to do." And so, there in the heart of the police station, with the radio blaring out the latest news of the German advance, we prayed. We prayed that this Dutchman would come to realize his worth in the sight of God and the worth of every other human being on earth. At the end of the prayer, the chief stood up. "Thank you, Miss Ten Boom." He shook my hand. "Thank you again. I know now that it was wrong to ask you." Still clutching my prison bag, I walked through the foyer and around the corner to the Beiji. Upstairs, the people crowded around wanting to know everything, but I did not tell them, not everything. I did not want Father and Betsy to know that we had just been asked to kill. It would have been an unnecessary burden for them to bear. The episode with the chief of police should have been encouraging. Apparently we had friends in high places. As a matter of fact, the news had the opposite effect upon us. Here was one more illustration of how our secret was no secret at all. All of Harlem seemed to know what we were up to. We knew we should stop the work, but how could we? Who would keep open the network of supplies and information on which the safety of hundreds depended? If a hideaway had to be abandoned, as happened all the time, who would coordinate the move to another address? We had to go on, but we knew that disaster could not be long in coming. As a matter of fact, it came first to the 17-year-old apprentice who had sought a safe home at the Beiji. Late one afternoon near the end of January 1944, Rolf stepped stealthily into the workshop. He glanced at Jop. I nodded. Jop was party to everything that went on in the house. There's an underground home in E that is going to be raided this evening. Do you have anyone who can go? But I did not. Not a single courier or escort person was at the Beiji this late in the day. I'll go, Jop said. I opened my mouth to protest that he was inexperienced and liable to the factory transport himself if stopped on the street. Then I thought of the unsuspecting people at Eid. We had a wardrobe of girls' scarves and dressed upstairs. Then quickly, boy, Rolf said, you must leave immediately. We gave Jop the details and hurried away. In a few moments, Jop reappeared, making a very pretty brunette in long coat and handkerchief, a fur muff hiding his hands. Did the lad have some kind of premonition? To my astonishment, he turned to the door and kissed me. Jop was supposed to be back at 7 p.m. curfew. 7 came and went. Perhaps he had been delayed, and would return in the morning. We did have a visitor early the next day, but it was not Jop. I knew the minute Rolf stepped through the door that bad news was weighing him down. It's Jop, isn't it? Yes. What happened? Rolf had learned the story from the sergeant at the night desk. When Jop got to the address of the Eid and Gestapo was already there, Jop had rung the bell. The door opened. Pretending to be the owner of the house, the SD man invited Jop in. And Corey, Rolf said, we must face it, the Gestapo will get information out of Jop. They have already taken him to Amsterdam. How long will he be able to hold his tongue? Once again we considered stopping the work. Once again we discovered we could not. That night Father and Betsy and I prayed long after the others had gone to bed. We knew that in spite of daily mounting risk, we had no choice but to move forward. This was evil's hour. We could not run away from it. Perhaps only when human effort had done its best and failed would God's power alone be free to work. End of chapter 8. The Hiding Place, Chapter 9. At the sound of someone in my room, I opened my eyes, painfully. It was Jussi, carrying up his bedding and nightclothes to store in the secret room. Behind him came Mary and Thea with their bundles. I shut my eyes again. It was the morning of February 28, 1944. For 2 days I had been in bed with influenza. My head throbbed. My joints were on fire. Every little sound, Mary's wheeze, the scrape of the secret panel, made me want to shriek. I heard Hink and Meta come in. Then Jussi's laugh as he handed the day things out to the others through the low door. Go away, all of you. Leave me alone. I bit my lip from saying it. At last they collected their clothes and belongings and trooped out, closing the door behind them. Where was Lindert? Why hadn't he come up? Then I remembered that Lindert was away for a few days, setting up electrical warning systems like ours in several of our host homes. I drifted back into a feverish sleep. The next thing I knew, Betsy was standing at the foot of my bed, a steaming cup of herb tea in her hand. I'm sorry to wake you, Corey, but there's a man down in the shop who insists he will only talk to you. Who is he? He says he's from Ermelo. I've never seen him before. I sat up shakily. That's all right. I'll have to get up anyway. Tomorrow, the new ration cards come. I sipped the scalding tea, then struggled to my feet. There by the bed lay my prison bag, packed and ready as it had been since the summons from the chief of police. In fact, I'd been adding to it. Besides the Bible, clothing, and toilet things, now it held vitamins, aspirins, iron pills for Betsy's anemia, and much else. I'd become a kind of talisman for me. It had become a kind of talisman for me, a safeguard against the terrors of prison. I got slowly into my clothes and stepped out onto the landing. The house seemed to reel around me. I crept down, clinging to the handrail. At the door to Tonty John's rooms, I was surprised to hear voices. I looked in. Of course, I had forgotten. It was Wednesday morning. People were gathering for Willem's weekly service. I saw Nollie passing around the occupation tea, as we called it, the current brew of roots and dried figs. Peter was already at the piano, as he was most weeks, to provide the music. I continued down the stairs, passing new arrivals streaming up. As I arrived, wobble-kneed, in the shop, a small, sandy-haired man sprang forward to meet me. "Miss Ten Boom." "Yes." There's an old Dutch expression, you can tell a man by the way he meets your eyes. This man seemed to concentrate somewhere between my nose and my chin. "Is it about a watch?" I asked. "No, Miss Ten Boom, something far more serious." His eyes seemed to make a circle around my face. "My wife has just been arrested. We've been hiding Jews, you see. If she is questioned, all our lives are in danger." I don't know how I can help," I said. "I need 600 guilders. There's a policeman at the station Ermello who can be bribed for that amount. I'm a poor man. I've been told you have certain contacts." "Contacts?" "Miss Ten Boom, it's a matter of life and death. If I don't get it right away, she'll be taken to Amsterdam, and then it will be too late." Something about the man's behavior made me hesitate, and yet how could I risk being wrong? "Come back in a half an hour. I'll have the money," I said. For the first time, the man's eyes met mine. "I'll never forget this," he said. The amount was more than we had at the Beiji, so I sent twos to the bank with instructions to hand the man the money, but not to volunteer any information. Then I struggled back up the stairs. Where 10 minutes earlier I had been burning with fever, now I was shaking with cold. I stopped at Tan Jin's rooms just long enough to take a briefcase of papers from the desk. Then, with apologies to Willem and the others, I continued to my room. I undressed again, refilled the vaporizer where it had been hissing on its small spirit stove, and climbed back into bed. For a while, I tried to concentrate on the names and addresses in the briefcase. 5 cards needed this month to Zandvoort, none in Overveen. I would need 18 in... The flu roared behind my eyes. The papers swam in front of me. The briefcase slipped from my hand, and I was asleep. In my fevered dream, a buzzer kept ringing. On and on it went. Why wouldn't it stop? Feet were running, voices whispering, "Hurry! Hurry!" I sat bolt upright. People were running past my bed. I turned just in time to see Thea's heels disappear through the low door. Meta was behind her, then Henk. But I hadn't planned a drill for today. Who in the world... Unless it wasn't a drill. Yussi dashed past me, white-faced, his pipe rattling in the ashtray that he carried shaking in his hands. At last it penetrated my numbed brain that the emergency had come. 1, 2, 3 people already in the secret room. 4, as Yussi's black shoes and scarlet socks disappeared. But Mary, where was Mary? The old woman appeared in the bedroom door, mouth open, gasping for air. I sprang from my bed and half pulled, half shoved her across the room. I was sliding the secret panel door down behind her when a slim, white-haired man burst into the room. I recognized him from Pickwick's, someone high in the national residence and in the national resistance. I had no idea he was in the house. He dived in after Mary. 5, 6, yes, that was right. I was right, with Lindert away. The man's legs vanished, and I dropped the panel door down and leapt back into bed. Below, I heard doors slamming, heavy footsteps on the stairs, but it was another sound that turned my blood to water. The strangling, grasping rasp of Mary's breathing. "Lord Jesus," I prayed, "you have the power to heal. Heal Mary now." And then my eye fell on the briefcase, stuffed with names and addresses. I snatched it up, yanked up the sliding door again, flung the case inside, shoved the door down, and pushed my prison bag up against it. I had just reached the bed again when the bedroom door flew open. "What's your name?" I sat up slowly. I hoped, sleepily. "What?" "Your name." "Cornelia Ten Boom." The man was tall and heavy-set, with a strange, pale face. He wore an ordinary blue business suit. He turned and shouted down the stairs, "We've got one more up here, Willems." He turned back to me. "Get up. Get dressed." As I crawled out from under the covers, the man took a slip of paper from his pocket and consulted it. "So you're the ringleader?" He looked at me with new interest. "Tell me now, where are you hiding the Jews?" "I don't know what you're talking about." The man laughed. "And you don't know anything about an underground ring either. Well, we'll see about that." He had not taken his eyes off of me, so I began to pull on my clothes over my pajamas, ears straining for a sound from the secret room. "Let me see your papers." I pulled out the little sack that I wore around my neck. When I took out my identification folder, a roll of bills fell out with it. The man stooped, snatched up the money from the floor, stuffed it in his pocket. Then he took my papers and looked at them. For a moment, the room was silent. Mariatali's wheeze. Why wasn't I hearing it? The man threw the papers back at me. "Hurry up." But he was not in half the hurry I was to get away from that room. I buttoned my sweater all wrong in my haste and stuffed my feet into my shoes without bothering to tie them. Then I was about to reach for my prison bag. Wait. It stood where I had shoved it in my panic, directly in front of the secret panel. If I were to reach down under the shelf to get it now, with this man watching my every move, might not his attention be attracted to the last place on earth I wanted him to look? It was the hardest thing I had ever done, to turn and walk out of that room, leaving the bag behind. I stumbled down the stairs, my knees shaking as much from fear as from flu. A uniformed soldier was stationed in front of Tonty John's rooms. The door was shut. I wondered if the prayer meeting had ended, if Willem and Nollie and Peter had gotten away, or were they still in there? How many innocent people might be involved? The man behind me gave me a little push, and I hurried on down the stairs to the dining room. Father, Betsy, Twos were sitting on chairs pulled back against the wall. Beside them sat 3 underground workers who must have arrived since I had gone upstairs. On the floor beneath the window, broken in 3 pieces, lay the Alfina sign. Someone had managed to knock it from the seal. A second Gestapo agent in plain clothes was pawing eagerly through a pile of silver rizzottos and jewelry heaped on the dining room table. It was the cachet from the space behind the corner cupboard. It had been indeed the first place they looked. "Here's the other one, listed at the address," said the man who had brought me down. "My information says she's the leader of the whole outfit." The man at the table, the one called Wilms, glanced at me, then turned back to the loot in front of him. "You know what to do, Kaeperding." Kaeperding seized me by the elbow and shoved me ahead of him down the remaining 5 steps into the rear of the shop. Another soldier in uniform stood guard just inside the store. Kaeperding prodded me through the front room and pushed me against the wall. "Where are the Jews?" "There aren't any Jews here." The man struck me hard across the face. "Where do you hide the ration cards?" "I don't know what you're—" Kaeperding hit me again. I staggered up against the astronomical clock. Before I could ever recover, he slapped me again, then again and again, stinging blows that jerked my head backward. "Where are the Jews?" Another blow. "Where's your secret room?" I tasted blood in my mouth. My head spun. My ears rang. I was losing consciousness. "Lord Jesus," I cried, "protect me." Kaeperding's hands stopped in midair. "If you say that name again, I'll kill you." But instead, his arms slowly dropped to his side. "If you won't talk, that skinny one will." I stumbled ahead of him up the stairs. He pushed me into one of the chairs against the dining room wall. Through a blur, I saw him lead Betsy from the room. Above us, hammer blows and splintering wood showed where a squad of trained searchers were probing for the secret room. Then down in the alley, the doorbell rang. But the sign! Didn't they see the Alfina sign was gone? And I glanced at the window and caught my breath. There on the seal, the broken pieces fitted carefully together, sat the wooden triangle. Too late, I looked up to see Wilms staring intently at me. I thought so, he said. It was a signal, wasn't it? He ran down the stairs. Above us, the hammering and the tramp of boots had stopped. I heard the alley door open and Wilms' voice, smooth and agitating. Come in, won't you? Have you heard? A woman's voice said. They've got Omen Herman. Pickwick? Not Pickwick. Oh, I heard Wilms say. Who was with him? He pumped her as hard as he could, then placed her under arrest. Blinking with fright and confusion, the woman was seated with us along the wall. I recognized her only as the person who occasionally took messages for us about the city. I stared in anguish at the sign in the window announcing to the world that all was usual at the Beiji. Our home had been turned into a trap. How many more would fall into it before this day was over? And Pickwick? Had they really caught Pickwick? Capperdine appeared with Betsy in the dining room door. Her lips were swollen and puffy. A bruise was darkening on her cheek. She half fell into the chair next to mine. Oh, Betsy, he hurt you. Yes, she dabbed at the blood on her mouth. I feel so sorry for him. Capperdine whirled, his white face even paler. Prisoners will remain silent, he shrieked. Two men were clumping down the stairs and into the dining room, carrying something between them. They had discovered the old radio beneath the stairs. Law-abiding citizens, are you? Capperdine went on. You, the old man there. I see you believe in the Bible. He jerked his thumb at the well-worn book on its shelf. Tell me, what does it say in there about obeying the government? Fear God, Father quoted. And on his lips in that room the words came as blessing and reassurance. Fear God and honor the Queen. Capperdine stared at him. It doesn't say that. The Bible doesn't say that. No, Father admitted. It says fear God, honor the King. But in our case, it's the Queen. It's not King or Queen, says Capperdine. What's the legal government now? We're the legal government now, and you are all lawbreakers. The doorbell rang again. Again there were questions and arrests. The young man, one of our workers, had barely been assigned a chair when again the bell sounded. It seemed to me that we had never had so many callers. The dining room was getting crowded. I felt sorriest for those who had come simply on social visits. An elderly retired missionary was brought in, jaw quivering with fear. At least, from the banging and thumping above, they had not yet discovered the secret room. A new sound made me jump. The phone down in the hall was ringing. That's a telephone, cried Wilms. He glared at the room, then grabbing me by the wrist, yanked me down the stairs behind him. He thrust the receiver up against my ear, but kept his own hand on it. Answer, he said with his lips. This is the Tim Boom residence and shop, I said stiffly as I dared. But the person on the other end did not catch the strangeness. Miss Tim Boom, you're in terrible danger. They've arrested Herman Schruller. They know everything. You've got to be careful. On and on the woman's voice babbled, the man at my side hearing everything. She had scarcely hung up the phone when the phone rang again. A man's voice, and again the message. Omen Herman's been taken to the police station. That means they're onto everything. At last, the third time I repeated my formal and untypical little greeting. There was a click on the other end. Wilms snatched the earpiece from my head. Hello? Hello, he shouted. He jingled the cradle on the wall. The line had gone dead. He shoved me back up the stairs and into my chair again. Our friend's wised up, he told Caperdine, but I've heard enough. Apparently Betsy had received permission to leave her chair. She was slicing bread in the slice board. I was surprised to realize it was already lunchtime. Betsy passed the bread around the room, but I shook my head. The fever was raging again. My throat ached and my head throbbed. The man appeared in the doorway. We've searched the whole place, Wilms, he said. If there's a secret room here, the devil himself built it. Wilms looked from Betsy to Father to me. "There's a secret room," he said quietly, "and people are using it or they would have admitted it. All right, we'll set a guard around this house till they've turned to mummies." In the hush of horror which followed, there was a gentle pressure on my knees. Mayor Shallow Hasbots had jumped into my lap to rub against me. I stroked the shining black fur. What would become of him now? I would not let myself think about the 6 people upstairs. It had been half an hour since the doorbell had rung last. Whoever had caught my message over the phone must have spread the alarm. Word was out. No one else would walk into the trap at the Beiji. Apparently, Wilms had come to the same conclusion because abruptly he ordered us to our feet and down the hallway with our coats and hats. Father, Betsy, and me held in the dining room till last. In front of us down the stairs came the people from Tonty John's rooms. I held my breath, scanning them. Apparently, most of those at the prayer service had left before the raid, but by no means at all. Here came Nollie, behind her, Peter. Last in line came Willem. The whole family then. Father, all 4 of his children, 1 grandchild. Caperton gave me a shove. "Get moving." Father took his tall hat from the wall peg. Outside the dining room, he paused to pull up the weights on the old Frisian clock. "We mustn't let the clock run down," he said. "Father, do you really think that we would be back home when the next chain ran out?" Snow had gone from the streets. Puddles of dirty water stood in the gutters as we marched through the alley and into the Smeedstraat. The walk took only a minute, but by the time we got inside the double doors of the police station, I was shaking with cold. I looked anxiously around the foyer for Rolf and others we knew, but saw no one. A contingent of German soldiers seemed to be supplementing the regular police force. We were herded along a corridor and through the heavy metal door where I had last seen Harry DeVries. At the end of this hall was a large room that had obviously been a gymnasium. Windows high and the walls were covered with wire mesh. Rings and basketball hoops were roped to the ceiling. Now a desk stood in the center of the room with a German army soldier seated behind it. Tumbling mats had been spread out to cover part of the floor, and I collapsed onto one of them. For 2 hours, the officer took down names, addresses, and other statistics. I counted those who had been arrested with us. 35 people from the raid on the Beiji. People from previous arrests were sitting or lying about on the mats too. Some of the faces we knew. I looked for Pickwick, but he was not among them. One of them, a fellow watchmaker who often came to the Beiji on business, seeming especially distressed at what had happened to us. He came and sat down beside Father and me. At last the officer left. For the first time since the alarm buzzer sounded, we could talk amongst ourselves. I struggled to sit up. "Quick," I croaked. "We've got to agree on what to say. Most of us can simply tell the truth," but my voice died in my throat. It seemed to my flu-addled brain that Peter was giving me the most ferocious frown I had ever seen. But if they learn that Uncle Willem was teaching this morning from the Old Testament, it would make trouble for him, Peter finished for me. He jerked his head to one side, and I clambered unsteadily to my feet. "Tonty Corey," he hissed when we were on the other side of the room. "That man, the watchmaker, he's a Gestapo plant." He patted my head as though I were a sick child. "Lie down again, Tonty Corey. Just for heaven's sake, don't do any talking." I was waked by the heavy door of the gym slamming open. In strode Rolf. "Let's have it quiet in here," he shouted. He leaned close to Willem and said something I could not hear. "Toilets are out back," he continued in a loud voice. "You can go one at a time under escort." Willem sat down beside me. "He says we can flush the incriminating papers if we shred them fine enough." I fumbled through my coat pockets. There were several scraps of paper and a billfold containing a few paper Ridstalters. I went over each of them, trying to think how I would explain it in a court process. Beside the row of outdoor toilets was a basin with a tin cup on a chain. Gratefully, I took a long drink, the first since tea Betsy had brought me that morning. Toward evening, a policeman carried into the gym a large basket of fresh hot rolls. I could not swallow mine. Only the water tasted good to me, though I grew embarrassed at asking again and again to be taken outside. Then when I got back the last time, a group had gathered around Father for evening prayers. Every day of my life had ended like this, that deep, steady voice, that sure and eager confiding us all to the care of God. The Bible lay at home on its shelf, but much of it was stored in his heart. His blue eyes seemed to be seeing beyond the locked and crowded room, beyond Harlem, beyond earth itself, as he quoted from memory, "Thou art my hiding place and my shield. I hope in thy word. Hold thou me up, and I shall be safe." None of us slept much. Each time someone left the room, he had to step over a dozen others. At last, light crept through the high, screened windows at the top of the room. The police again brought rolls. As the long morning wore on, I dozed with my back up against the wall. The worst pain now seemed to be in my chest. It was noon when soldiers entered the room and ordered us to our feet. Hastily we struggled into our coats and filed again through the cold corridors. In the Smeedstraat, a wall of people pressed against police barricades set across the street. As Betsy and I stepped out with Father between us, a murmur of horror greeted the sight of Harlem's grand old man being led to prison. In front of the door stood a green city bus with soldiers occupying the rear seats. People were climbing aboard while friends and relatives in the crowd wept or simply stared. Betsy and I gripped Father's arms to start down the steps. Then we froze. Stumbling past us between two soldiers, hatless and coatless, came Pitwick. The top of his bald head was a welter of bruises. Dried blood clung to the stubble on his chin. He did not look up as he was hauled into the bus. Father, Betsy, and I squeezed into a double seat near the front. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of Tyne standing in the crowd. It was one of those radiant winter days when the air seemed to shimmer with light. The bus shuddered, and it started up. Police cleared a path, and we inched forward. I gazed hungrily out the window, holding onto Harlem with my eyes. Now we were crossing the Grote Mark, the walls of the great cathedral glowing 1,000 shades of gray in the crystal light. In a strange way, it seemed to me that I had lived through this moment before. Then I recalled the vision I had had the night of the invasion. I had seen it all. Willem, Nollie, Pitwick, Peter, all of us here, drawn against our wills across this square. It had all been in the dream, all of us leaving Harlem, unable to turn back. Going where? End of chapter 9. The Hiding Place, Chapter 10, Scheveningen. Outside Harlem, the bus took the road south, paralleling the sea. On our right rose the low, sandy hills of the Dun country, soldiers silhouetted on the ridges. Clearly, we were not being taken to Amsterdam. A 2-hour drive brought us instead into the streets of The Hague. The bus stopped in front of a new, functional building. Word was whispered back that this was the Gestapo headquarters for all of Holland. We were all marched, all but Pickwick, who seemed unable to rise out of his seat, into a large room where the endless process of taking down names, addresses, and occupations began all over again. On the other side of the counter, running the length of the room, I was startled to see both Willems and Caperdam. As each of the prisoners from Harlem reached the desk, one or the other would lean forward and speak to a man seated at a typewriter, and there would be a chatter of sound from the machine. Suddenly the chief interrogator's eyes fell on Father. "That old man," he cried. "Did he have to be arrested? You, old man." Willem led Father up to the desk. The Gestapo chief leaned forward. "I'd like to send you home, old fellow," he said. "I'll take your word that you won't cause any more trouble." I could not see Father's face, only the erect carriage of his shoulders and the halo of his white hair above them, but I heard his answer. "If I go home today," he said evenly and clearly, "tomorrow I will open my door again to any man in need who knocks." The amiability drained from the other man's face. "Get back in line," he shouted. "Schnell! This court will not tolerate no more delays." But delays seemed all that this court existed for. As we inched along the counter, there were endless repetitions of questions, endless consulting of papers, endless coming and going of officials. Outside the windows, the short winter day was fading. We had not eaten since the rolls and water at dawn. Ahead of me in line, Betsy answered, "Unmarried," for the 20th time that day. "Number of children?" droned the interrogator. "I'm unmarried," Betsy repeated. The man did not even look up from his papers. "Number of children?" he snapped. "No children," said Betsy resignedly. Toward nightfall, a stout little man wearing the yellow star was led past us to the far end of the room. The sound of scuffling made us all look up. The wretched man was attempting to hold onto something clutched in his hands. "It's mine," he kept shouting. "You can't take it. You can't take my purse." What madness possessed him? What good did he imagine money would do him now? But he continued to struggle, to the obvious glee of the men around him. "Here, Jew," I heard one of them say. He lifted his booted foot and kicked the small man in the back of the knees. "This is how we take things from a Jew." It made so much noise. This was all I could think as they continued to kick him. I clutched the counter to keep from falling myself as the sounds continued. Wildly, unreasonably, I hated the man being kicked. I hated him for being so helpless and so hurt. At last I heard them drag him out. Then all at once I was standing in front of the chief questioner. I looked up and met Caberden's eyes, just behind him. "This woman was the ringleader," he said. Through the turmoil inside me, I realized it was important for the other man to believe him. "What Mr. Caberden says is true," I said. "These others, they know nothing about it. It was all—" "My name?" the interrogator required, imperturbably. "Cornelia ten Boom." "And I'm the—" "Age?" 52. The rest of the people had nothing to do. "Occupation?" "But I've told you dozens of times," I burst out in desperation. "Occupation," he repeated. It was a dark night when we were marched at last out of the building. The green bus was gone. Instead, we made out the bulk of a large canvas-roofed army truck. The two soldiers had to lift Father over the tailgate. There was no sign of Pickwick. Father, Betsy, and I found places to sit on the narrow bench that ran around the sides. The truck had no springs and bounced roughly over the bomb-pitted streets of the Hague. I slipped my arm behind Father's back to keep him from striking the edge. Willem, standing near the back, whispered back that he could see of the what he could see of the blacked-out city. We had left the downtown section and seemed to be heading west toward the suburb of Schregenvision. That was our destination then, the federal penitentiary named after this seaside town. The truck jerked to a halt. We heard a screech of iron. We bumped forward a few feet and stopped again. Behind us, massive gates clanked shut. We climbed down to find ourselves in an enormous courtyard surrounded by a high brick wall. The truck had backed up to a long, low building. Soldiers prodded us inside. I blinked in the white glare of bright ceiling lights. "Nossen gegen Mauer. Noses to the wall." I felt a shove from behind and found myself staring at cracked plaster. I turned my eyes as far as I could, first left and then right. There was Willem, 2 places away from me. Betsy. Next to me on the other side was twos. All like me, standing with their faces to the wall. Where was Father? There was an endless wait. while the scars on the wall before my eyes became faces, landscapes, animal shapes. Then somewhere to the right a door opened. "Women prisoners, follow me." The matron's voice sounded as metallic as the squealing door. As I stepped away from the wall, I glanced swiftly around the room for Father. There he was, a few feet out from the wall, seated in a straight-back chair. One of the guards must have brought it for him. Already the matron was starting down the long corridor that I could see through the door, but I hung back, gazing desperately at Father, Willem, Peter, all our brave underground workers. "Father," I cried suddenly, "God be with you." His head turned toward me. The harsh overhead light flashed from his glasses. "And with you, my daughters," he said. I turned and followed the others. Behind me, the door slammed closed. "And with you, and with you." "Oh, Father, when will I see you next?" Betsy's hand slipped around mine. A strip of coconut palm matting ran down the center of the white wall. We stepped into it off the damp concrete. "Prisoners, walk on to the side." It was the bored voice of the guard behind us. "Prisoners must not step on the matting." Guiltily, we stepped off the privileged mat. Ahead of us, in the corridor, was a desk. Behind it, a woman in uniform. As each prisoner reached this point, she gave her name for the 1,000th time that day and placed on the desk whatever she was wearing of value. Nollie, Betsy, and I unstrapped our beautiful wristwatches. As I handed mine to the officer, she pointed to the simple gold ring that had belonged to Mama. I wrinkled it from my finger and laid it on the desk along with my wallet and paper guilders. The procession down the corridor continued. The walls on both sides of us were lined with narrow metal doors. Now the column of women halted. The matron was fitting a key into one of them. We heard the thud of a bolt drawn back and the screech of hinges. The matron consulted a list in her hand, then called the name of a lady I didn't even know, one of those who had been at the Willem's prayer meeting. Was it possible that had been only yesterday? Was this only Thursday night? Already the events of the Beiji seemed part of another lifetime. The door banged shut. The column moved on. Another door unlocked, another human being closed behind it. No, 2 from Harlem in the same cell. Among the very first names read from the list was Betsy's. She stepped through the door. Before she could turn or say goodbye, it had closed. 2 cells farther down, Nollie left me. The clang of those 2 doors rang in my ears as the slow march continued. Now the corridor branched and we turned left, then right, then left again, an endless world of steel and concrete. 10 boom, Cornelia. Another door rasped open. The cell was deep and narrow, scarcely wider than the door. A woman lay on the single cot, 3 others on straw sticks on the floor. "Give this one the cot," the matron said. "She's sick." And indeed, even as the door slammed behind me, a spasm of coughing seized my chest and throat. "We don't want a sick woman in here," someone shouted. They were stumbling to their feet, backing as far from me as the narrow cubicle would allow. I'm so very sorry," I began. But another voice interrupted me. "Don't be. It's not your fault. Come on. Frere Mikes, give her the cot." The young woman turned to me. "Let me hang up your hat and coat." Gratefully, I handed her my hat, which she added to a row of clothes hanging from hooks along one wall, but I kept my coat wrapped tight around me. The cot had been vacated, and I moved shakily toward it, trying not to sneeze or breathe. As I squeezed past my cellmates, I sank down on the narrow bed, then went into a fresh spasm of coughs as loud, choking black dust rose from the filthy straw mattress. At last the attack passed and I lay down. The sour straw smell filled my nostrils. I felt each slat of wood through the thin pallet. I will never be able to sleep on such a bed, I thought. And the next thing I knew, it was morning, and there was a clattering at the door. "Food call," my cellmates told me. I struggled to my feet. A A square of metal had dropped open in the door, forming a small shelf. Onto this, someone in the hall was placing tin plates filled with steaming gruel. "There's a new one here," the woman called. Frau Mikes through the aperture. "We get 5 portions." Another tin plate was slammed onto the shelf. "If you're not hungry," Frau Mikes added, "I'll help you eat with it. I'll help you with it." I picked up my plate, stared at the watery gray porridge, and handed it silently to her. In a little while, the plates were collected, and the pass through the door slammed shut. Later in the morning, a key grated in the lock. The bolt banged and the door opened long enough for a sanitary bucket to be passed out. The wash basin was also emptied and returned with clean water. The woman picked up the straw pallets from the floor and piled them in a corner, raising a fresh storm of dust, which started me coughing helplessly again. Then a prison boredom, which I soon learned for fear, above all else, settled over the cell. At first I attempted to relieve it by talking with the others, but though they were as courteous as people can be, who were living literally on top of one another, they turned aside my questions, and I never learned much about them. The young woman who had spoken kindly to me the night before, I did discover, was a baroness, only 17 years old. This young girl paced constantly from morning until overhead light bulb went off at night. 6 steps to the door, 6 steps back, dodging those sitting on the floor, back and forth like an animal in a cage. Frau Mikes turned out to be an Austrian woman who had worked as a charwoman in the office building. She often cried for her canary. "Poor little thing, what will become of him? They'll never think to feed him." This would start me thinking about our cat. Had Mauer, Schaller, Hosbeds, Baz made his escape into the street, or was he starving inside the seal house? I would picture him prowling among the chair legs in the dining room, missing the shoulders he loved to walk on. I tried not to let my mind venture higher in the house, nor let it climb to the stairs to see if Thea, Mary, Yusi. No, I could do nothing for them here in this cell. God knew they were there. One of my cellmates had spent 3 years here in Schravingen. She could hear the rattle of the metal cart long before the rest of us, and tell by the footstep who was passing in the corridor. That's the trustee from the medical supply. Someone's sick. This is the 4th time someone in 316 has gone for a hearing. Her world consisted of this cubicle and the corridor outside, and soon I began to see the wisdom of this narrowed vision, and why prisoners instinctively shied away from questions about their larger lives. For the first days of my imprisonment, I stayed in a frenzy of anxiety about Father, Betsy, Willem, Pickwick. Was Father able to eat this food? Was Betsy's blanket as thin as this one? But these thoughts led to such despair that I soon learned not to give in to them. In an effort to fix my mind on something, I asked Frau Mikes to teach me the card game that she played hour after hour. She had made the cards herself with squares of toilet paper that were issued 2 a day to each prisoner. All day she sat on a corner of the cot, endlessly laying them out in front of her and gathering them up again. I was a slow learner, since no cards of any kind had ever been played at the Beiji. Now, as I began to grasp the solitaire game, I wondered what Father's resistance to them had been. Surely nothing could be more innocent than this succession of shapes called clubs, spades, and diamonds. But as the days passed, I began to discover a subtle danger. When the cards went well, my spirits rose. It was an omen. Someone from Haarlem had been released. But if I lost, maybe someone was ill. The people in the secret room had been found. At last, I had to stop playing. In any case, I was finding it hard to sit up so long. Increasingly, I was spending the days as I did nights, tossing on the thin straw pallet, trying in vain to find a position in which all aches at once were eased. My head throbbed continually. Pain shot up and down my arms. My cough brought up blood. I was thrashing feverishly on the cot one morning when the cell door opened, and there stood the steel-voiced matron I had seen the night I entered the cell 2 weeks before. "Ten Boom! Cornelia! I struggled to my feet. Bring your hat and your coat and come with me. I looked around for the others for a hint as to what was happening. You're going to the outside, our prison expert said. When you take your hat, you always go outside. My coat I was wearing already, but I took my hat from its hook and stepped out into the corridor. The matron relocked the door and then set off so rapidly my heart hammered as I trotted after her, carefully to stay off the precious matting. I stared yearningly at the locked doors on the other side of us. I could not remember behind which ones my sisters had disappeared. At last we stepped out into the broad, hide-wall courtyard. Sky! For the first time in 2 weeks, blue sky. How high the clouds were, how inexpressibly white and clean. I remembered suddenly how much sky had meant to Mama. Quick, snapped the matron. I hurried into the shiny black automobile beside which she was standing. She opened the rear door and I got in. The others were already in the back seat, a soldier and a woman with a gaunt gray face. And in front, next to the driver, slumped a desperately ill-looking man whose head lolled strangely on the seat back. As the car started up, the woman beside me lifted a blood-stained towel to her mouth and coughed into it. I understood. The three of us were ill. Perhaps we were going to a hospital. The massive prison gate opened, and we were in the outside world, spinning along broad city streets. I stared in wonderment through the window. People walking, looking in store windows, stopping to talk with friends. Had I truly been as free as that only 2 weeks ago? The car parked before an office building. It took both the soldier and the driver to get the sick man up the 3 flights of stairs. We entered a waiting room jammed with people and sat down under the watchful eyes of the soldier. When nearly an hour had passed, I had permission to use the lavatory. The soldier spoke to the trim white uniformed nurse behind the reception desk. This way, she said crisply. She took me down a short hall, stepped into the bathroom with me, and shut the door. Quick, is there anything I can help? Is there any way I can help? I blinked at her. Yes, oh yes. A Bible. Could you get me a Bible and a needle and thread and a toothbrush and soap? She bit her lip doubtfully. So many patients today and the soldier, but I'll do what I can. She was gone. But her kindness shone in the little room as brightly as gleaming white tiles and shiny faucets. My heart soared as I scrubbed the grime off my neck and face. A man's voice at the door. Come on, you've been in there long enough. Hastily I rinsed off the soap and followed the soldier back to the waiting room. The nurse was back at her desk, coolly efficient as before. She did not look up. After another long wait, my name was called. The doctor asked me to cough, took my temperature and blood pressure, applied his stethoscope, and announced that I had pleurisy with infusion, pre-tubercular. He wrote something on a sheet of paper. Then, with one hand on the doorknob, he laid the other for an instant on my shoulder. I hope, he said in a low voice, that I am doing you a favor with this diagnosis. In the waiting room, the soldier was on his feet ready for me. As I crossed the room, the nurse rose briskly from her desk and swished past me. In my hand, I felt a small, knobby something wrapped in paper. I slid it into my coat pocket as I followed the soldier down the stairs. The other woman was already back in the car. The sick man did not reappear. All during the return ride, my hand kept straying to the object in my pocket, stroking it, tracing the outline. Oh, Lord, it's so small, but still it could be. Let it be a Bible. The high walls loomed ahead. The gate rang shut behind us. At last, at the end of the long echoing corridors, I reached my cell and drew the package from my pocket. My cellmates crowded around me as I unwrapped the newspaper in trembled hands. Even the Baroness stopped her pacing to watch. As 2 bars of precious pre-war soap appeared, Frau Mikes clapped her hand over her mouth to suppress her yelp of triumph. No toothbrush or needle, but unheard of wealth, a whole packet of safety pins, and most wonderful of all, not indeed a whole Bible, but in 4 small booklets, the 4 Gospels. I shared the soap and pens among the 5 of us, but though I offered to divide the books as well, they refused. "They catch you with those?" the knowledgeable one said, "and it's double sentence, and cult cost as well. Culta cost." The bread ration alone, without the daily plate of hot food, was the punishment constantly held over our heads. If we made too much noise, we'd have Kolkost. If we were slow with the bucket, it would be Kultskost. But even Kultskost would be a small price to pay, I thought, as I stretched my aching body on the foul straw for the precious books I'd clutched between my hands. It was 2 evenings later, near the time when the light bulb usually flickered off, that the cell door banged open and a guard strode in. "Ten boom! Cornelia," she snapped. "Get your things." I stared at her, an insane hope rising in me. "You mean—" "Silence! No talking." It did not take long to gather my things, my hat, an undervest that was drying out after a vain attempt to get it clean, and the much-used basin water, my coat with the precious contents in its pocket and never yet been off of my back. Why such strict silence, I wondered. Why should I not be allowed to even say goodbye to my cellmates? Would it be so very wrong for a guard to smile now and then, or give a few words of explanation? I said farewell to the others with my eyes and followed the stiff-backed woman into the hall. She paused to lock the door, then marched off down the corridor, but the wrong way. We were not heading toward the outside entrance at all, but deeper into the maze of prison passageways. Still, without a word, she halted in front of another door and opened it with a key. I stepped inside. The door clanged behind me. The bolt slammed shut. The cell was identical with the one I had just left. 6 steps long, 2 wide, a single cot at the back. But this one was empty. As the guard's footsteps died away down the corridor, I leaned against the cold metal of the door, alone behind these walls. I must not let my thoughts run wildly. I must be mature and very practical. 6 steps. Sit down on the cot. This one reeked even worse than the other. The straw seemed to be fermenting. I reached for the blanket. Someone had been sick on it. I thrust it away, but it was too late. I dashed for the bucket near the door and leaned weakly over it. At that moment, the light bulb in the ceiling went out. I groped back to the cot and huddled there in the dark, setting my teeth against the stink of the bedding, wrapping my coat tighter about me. The cell was bitter cold. Wind hammered against the wall. This must be near the outside edge of the prison. The wind had never shrieked so in the other one. What had I done to be separated from people this way? Had they discovered the conversation with the nurse at the doctor's office, or perhaps some of the prisoners from Harlem had been interrogated and the truth about our group was known? Maybe my sentence was solitary confinement for years and years. In the morning, my fever was worse. I could not stand even long enough to get my food from the shelf in the door, and after an hour or so the plate was taken away, untouched. Toward evening, the pass-through dropped again, and the hunk of coarse prison bread appeared. By now I was desperate for food, but less able to walk than ever. Whoever was in the hall must have seen the problem. A hand picked up the bread and hurled it toward me. It landed on the floor beside the cot, where I clawed for it and gnawed it greedily. For several days, while the fever raged, my supper was delivered in this manner. Mornings, the door squilled open, and a woman in a blue smock carried the plate of hot gruel to the cot. I was as starved for the sight of a human face as for the food, and tried in a hoarse croak to start a conversation, but the woman, obviously a fellow prisoner, would only shake her head with a fearful glance toward the hall. The door also opened once a day to let in the trustee from the medical supply with a dose of some stinging yellow liquid from a very dirty bottle. The first time he entered the cell, I clutched at his sleeve. "Please," I rasped. "Have you seen an 84-year-old man, white hair, long beard, Casper Ten Boom? You must have taken medicine to him." The man tugged loose. I don't know anything." The cell door slammed back against the wall, framing framing the guard. Solitary prisoners were not permitted to talk. Solitary prisoners are not permitted to talk. If you say another word to one of the work-duty prisoners, it will be katkost for the duration of your sentence. And the door banged behind the two of them. The same trustee also charged with recording my temperature each time he came. I had to take off my shirt and place the thermometer between my arm and the other side of my body. It did not look to me like an accurate system, sure enough. By the end of the week, an irritable voice called through the food slot, "Get up and get the food yourself. Your fever's gone. You won't be waited on again." I felt sure the fever had not gone, but there was nothing for it but to creep, trembling, to the door for my plate. When I'd replaced it, I would lie down again on the smelly straw, steeling myself for the bawling out I knew would come. "Look at the great lady, back in bed again. Are you going to lie there all day long?" Why was lying down such a crime I could never understand, nor indeed was one supposed to accomplish. What were you supposed to accomplish if you did get up? Thoughts, now that I was alone, were a bigger problem than ever. I could no longer even pray for family and friends by name. So great was the fear and longing wrapped around each one. "Those I love, Lord," I would say. "You know them. You see them. Oh, bless them all." Thoughts were enemies. That prison bag, how many times I opened it in my mind and pawed through the things I had left behind. A fresh blouse, aspirin, a whole bottle of them, toothpaste with a kind of pepperminty taste, and then I would catch myself. How ridiculous, such thoughts. If I had it to do again, would I really put these personal comforts ahead of human lives? Of course not. But in the dark nights, as the wind howled and the fever pulsed, I would draw that bag out of some dark corner of my mind and root through it once again. A towel to lay on this scratchy straw, an aspirin. In only one way was this new cell an improvement over the first one. It had a window. 7 iron bars ran across it, 4 bars up and down. It was high in the wall, much too high to look out of, but through those 28 squares I could see the sky. All day I kept my eyes fixed on that bit of heaven. Sometimes clouds moved across the squares, white or pink or edged with gold, and then the wind was from the west. I could hear the sea. Best of all, for nearly an hour each day, gradually lengthening, the spring sun rose higher. A shaft of checkered light streamed into the dark little room. As the weather turned warmer, I grew stronger. I would stand up to catch the sunshine on my face and chest, moving along the wall with the moving light, climbing at last onto the cot to stand on tiptoe in the final rays. As my health returned, I was able to use my eyes longer. I had been sustaining myself from my scriptures, a verse at a time. Now, like a starving man, I gulped entire gospels at a reading, seeing the magnificent drama of salvation. As I did, an incredible thought prickled the back of my neck. Was it possible that this, all of this that seemed too wasteful, was so needless? This war, Schregenwegen, prison, this very cell, none of it was unforeseen or accidental. Could it be part of the pattern first revealed in the Gospels? Hadn't Jesus, and here my reading became intent indeed, hadn't Jesus been defeated as utterly and unarguably as our little group and our small plans had been? But if the Gospels were truly the pattern of God's activity, then defeat was only the beginning. I would look around this bare little cell and wonder what conceivable victory would come from a place like this. The prison expert in the first cell had taught me to make a kind of knife by rubbing a corset stay against the rough cement floor. It seemed to me strangely important not to lose track of time, and so with a sharp hewn stay I sketched a calendar on the wall behind the cot. As each long, featureless day crawled into a close, I checked off another square. I also started a record of special dates beneath the calendar. February 28th, 1944. Arrest, February 29th, 1944. Transport to Scheveningen, March 16th, 1944. Beginning of solitary, and now a new date. April 15th, 1944. My birthday in prison. A birthday had to mean a party, but I searched in vain for a single cheerful object, at least the other cell. In the other cell there had been bright bits of clothing. The Baroness' red hat, Frere Mike's yellow blouse. Now regretted, now my own lack of taste in clothes. At least I would have a long song at my party. At least I could have a song at my party. I chose one about the bride of Harlem tree. She would be full in bloom now. The child's song brought it all close. The bursting branches, the petals raining down like snow on the brick sidewalk. Quiet in there! A volley of blows sounded at my iron door. Solitary prisoners are to keep silent. I sat on the cot, opened the Gospel of John, and read until the ache in my heart went away. 2 days after my birthday, I was taken for the first time to the big, echoing shower room. A grim-faced guard marched beside me, or scowl forbidding me to take pleasure in the expedition. But nothing could dim the wonder of stepping into that wide corridor after many weeks of close confinement. At the door to the shower room, several women were waiting. Even in this streaked silence, this human closeness was joy and strength. I scanned the faces of those coming out, but neither Betsy nor Nollie was there, nor anyone else from Harlem. And yet I thought, they are all my sisters. How rich is anyone who can simply see human faces? The shower was glorious. Warm, clean water over my festering skin, streams of water through my matted hair. I went back to my cell with a new resolve. The next time I was permitted a shower, I would take with me 3 of my Gospels. Solitary was teaching me that it was not possible to be rich alone. And I was not alone much longer. Into my solitary cell came a small, busy black ant. I had almost put my foot where he was one morning, and I carried my bucket to the door when I realized the honor being done to me. I crouched down and admired the marvelous design of legs and the body. I apologized for my size and promised I would not so thoughtlessly stride about again. After a while he disappeared through a crack in the floor, but when my evening piece of bread appeared on the door shelf, I scattered some crumbs, and to my joy he popped out almost at once. He picked up a heroic piece, struggled down the hole with it, and came back for more. It was the beginning of a relationship. Now, in addition to the daily visit of the sun, I had company of this brave and handsome guest, in fact, soon of a whole small committee, as if I was washing out clothes in the basin, sharpening the point of my homemade knife. When the ants appeared, I stopped at once to give them my full attention. It would have been unthinkable to squander 2 activities on the same bit of time. One evening, as I was crossing another long, long day from the calendars scratched on my wall, I heard shouts far down the corridor. They were answered closer by. Now noisy voices came from every direction. How unusual for the prisoners to be making a racket. Where were the guards? The shelf in my door had not been closed since the bread came 2 hours ago. I pressed my ear to it and listened, but it was hard to make sense of the tumult outside. Names were being passed from cell to cell. People were singing, others pounding on their doors. The guards must all be away. Please, let's be quiet, a voice nearby pleaded. Let's use this time before they get back. What's happening? I cried through the open slot. Where are the guards? At the party, the same voice answered me. It's Hitler's birthday. Then there must be their own names. The people started shouting down the corridor. This was our chance to tell who we were, to get information. I'm Corey Ten Boom, I called through the food shelf. My whole family is here somewhere. Oh, has anyone seen Casper Ten Boom, Betsy Ten Boom, Nollie Van Warden, William Ten Boom? I shouted names until I was hoarse and heard them repeated from mouth to mouth down the long corridor. I passed names, too, to the right and to the left as we worked out a kind of system. After a while, answers began to filter back. Miss Vander Els is in cell 228. PTJ's arm is much better. Some of the messages I could hardly bear to relay. The hearing was very bad. He sits in his cell without speaking. To my husband, Joost, our baby died last week. Although the personal messages were rumors about the world outside, each more wildly optimistic than the last. There is a revolution in Germany. The Allies have invaded Europe. The war cannot last 3 weeks longer. At last some of the names I had shouted out began to return. Betsy Ten Boom is in cell 312. She says to tell you that God is good. Oh, that was Betsy. That was every inch Betsy. Then Nollie Van Worden was in cell 318. But she was released more than a month ago. Released? Oh, thank God. Twos, too, released. News from the men's section was longer returning, but it did my heart. Leapt higher and higher. Peter Van Worden, released. Herman Sluberg, released. Willem Ten Boom, released. As far as I could discover, every single one taken on the raid of the Beiji, with the exception of Betsy and me, had been freed. Only about Father I discovered no news at all. Although I called his name over and over into the murmuring hall, no one seemed to have seen him. No one seemed to know. It was perhaps a week later that my cell door opened, and a prison trustee tossed a package wrapped in brown paper onto the floor. I picked it up, hefted it, turned it over and over. The wrapping paper had been torn open and carelessly retied, but even though the disarray, I could spot Nollie's loving touch. I sat on the cot and opened it. There, familiar and welcoming as a visit from home, was the light blue embroidered sweater. As I put it on, I seemed to feel Nollie's arms circling my shoulders. Although inside the package were cookies and vitamins and needle and thread and a bright red towel, now Nollie understood the gray hunger of prison. She had even wrapped the cookies in gray-red cellophane. I was biting into the first one when an inspiration came to me. I dragged the cot out of the wall to stand under the naked overhead bulb. Climbing onto it, I fashioned a lampshade with the paper, a cheery red glow. At once, suffused the bleak little room. I was rewrapping the cookies in the brown outer paper when my eyes fell on the address written in Nollie's careful hand, slanting upward toward the postage stamp. But Nollie's handwriting did not slant. The stamp. Hadn't a message once come to the Beiji under a stamp? Penciled in the tiny square beneath? Laughing at my own overwrought imagination, I moistened the paper with a basin water to work the stamp gently free. Words. There was definitely writing there, but so tiny I had to climb again onto the cot and hold the paper close to the shaded bulb. All the watches in your closet are safe. Safe. Then Usi and Hink and Mary, they'd gotten out of the secret room. They'd escaped. They were free. I burst into racking sobs and then heard heavy steps bearing down the corridor. Hastily, I jumped down from the cot and shoved it back to the wall. The pass-through clattered open. What's the commotion in here? It's nothing. I won't do it again. The slot in the door slammed shut. How had they managed it? How had they got past the soldiers? Never mind, dear Lord, you were there, and that's all that matters. The cell door opened to let a German officer, followed in by the head matron herself. My eyes ran hungrily over the well-pressed uniform and its rows of brilliant-colored battle ribbons. Miss Ten Boom, the officer began in excellent Dutch. I have a few questions I believe you can help me with. The matron was carrying a small tool, which she leapt to set down for the officer. I stared at her. Was this obese creature the terrible voiced terror of the woman's wing? The officer sat down, motioning me to take the cot. There was something in that gesture that belonged to the world outside the prison. As he took out a small notebook and began to read names from it, I was conscious of my ruffled clothes, my long, ragged fingernails. To my relief, I honestly did not know any of the names he read. Now I understood the wisdom of the ubiquitous Mr. Schmidt. The officer stood up. Will you be feeling well enough to come for your hearing soon? Again, the ordinary human manner. Yes, I hope so. The officer stepped out of the hall, a matron bobbing and scurrying after him with the stool. It was the 3rd of May. I was sitting on my cot sewing. Since Nollie's package had been delivered, I had a wonderful new occupation. One by one, I was pulling the threads from the red towel, and with them embroidered bright figures on the pajamas that I had only recently stopped wearing beneath my clothes. A window with ruffled curtains, a flower with an impossible number of petals and leaves. I just started work on the head of the cat over the right pocket when the food shelf in the door banged open and shut with a single motion, and there on the floor of the cell lay a letter. I dropped the pajamas and sprang forward. Nollie's writing. Why should my hand tremble as I picked it up? The letter had been opened by the censors, held by them too. The postmark was over a week old, but it was a letter from home, the very first one. Why this sudden fear? I unfolded the paper. Corey, can you be very brave? No, I couldn't be brave. I forced my eyes to read on. I have news that is very hard to write to you. Father survived his arrest by only 10 days. He is now with the Lord. I stood with the paper between my hands, so long that the daily shaft of sunlight entered the cell and fell upon it. Father. The letter glittered in the crisscross light as I read the rest. Nollie had no details, not how or where he had died, not even where he was buried. Footsteps were passing on the coconut matting. I ran to the door and pressed my face to the closed pass-through. Please, oh please. The steps stopped. The shelf dropped open. What's the matter? Please, I've had bad news. Oh, please don't go away. Wait a minute. The footsteps retreated, then returned with a jangle of keys. The cell door opened. Here. The young woman handed me a pill with a glass of water. It's a sedative. This letter just came, I explained. It says that my father has died. The girl stared at me. Your father, she said in astonished tones. I realized how very old and decrepit I must look to this young person. She stood in the doorway a while, obviously embarrassed at my tears. Whatever happens, she said at last, you brought it on yourself by breaking the laws. Dear Jesus, I whispered as the door slammed and her footsteps died away. How foolish of me to have called for human help when you were here. To think that Father sees you now, face to face. To think that he and Mama are together again, walking those bright streets. I pulled the cot from the wall, and below the calendar scratched another date. March 9th, 1944. Father released. End of chapter 10.